Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series. What if Deku became the ultimate Spider-Man? Part 1. If you enjoy this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Your attempt to enroll in UA's hero course was impressive, Mr. Midoriya. Your written exam score was among the highest in the school's history, and you have been marked for immediate enrollment in our general studies and support courses. As for your practical exam attempts, while you did earn a small number of combat points, I regret to notify you that you did not earn enough to be eligible for UA's hero course. A letter asking for your signature regarding your desire to enroll in our general studies or support course is enclosed for your signature. I hope to speak with you shortly, Principal Nezu. By this point, Izuku had read the letter numerous times and had the letters for the general studies and support courses ready for his signature. But despite his desire to enroll at UA, he was unable to get himself to sign the paperwork. He had spent the previous year getting his physique ready for the test since he was so determined to prove himself worthy of being a hero. After attending a martial arts lesson, he had learned how to protect himself and was much stronger today, yet even that had not helped. The child groaned as he grabbed the rejection letter in his hands, tore it straight down the middle, then tore it into smaller pieces and tossed them into the trash can next to his desk. "I guess All Might was right," he said. Izuku got out of his chair and left his room, where his mother was anxiously waiting, after taking a few of his inventions from his desk and putting them in his pocket. After glancing at her son's face, the mother embraced him and said, "Oh, sweetheart," bringing him into her arms and sobbing, "I'm so sorry." Izuku gave her a back pat without paying attention. The child answered automatically, "It's okay," adding, "They said I can still get into general studies and the support course." The words, "Oh, then isn't that better than being outright turned away?" instantly lifted his mother's spirits. She smiled up at him, trying to make him feel better. "And you would still be able to help heroes with your inventions. Like those little gadgets you like to tinker with all the time." "Yeah," Izuku said, and the youngster sighed before turning to leave his mother. He then made his way to the door. As his mother called out to him, he reached for a light green jacket. "Hero work is dangerous even for those that have powerful quirks, but for you," she said, not realizing that she was shattering his heart even more. "Izuku, sweetie, I know this isn't what you wanted, but realistically, this is much better for you." Something inside the child cracked after hearing the same thing for 10 years, and everything came spilling out as he lost his temper. His mother's eyes widened in surprise as Izuku yelled, "You think I don't know that? Believe me, I do," he pounded out as the lady stood in a daze. "I've had to live with my dream being shattered at every turn by you, my teachers, and people I thought were my friends." "Izuku," she whimpered, trying to soothe him. "And don't think I don't know why Dad never comes home, or even calls us anymore," the boy hissed, still not finished his tirade. "He's ashamed of me, and can't stand the sight of his quirkless son." He retreated toward the door, adding, "Kachan was right. A swan dive off the balcony would be." "Izuku Midoriya," his mother exclaimed, appalled at what he had said, as he simply turned away and left the apartment, the door slamming behind him. She slumped to the floor and sobbed, her tears streaming down her face. Then the words of her son began to echo in her mind. Kachan was correct. Kachan was correct. "Katsuki," she said, getting up to grab the phone and dialing the Bakugo home. "Mitsuki? It's Inko. We need to have a talk, now." Supaidaemon Izuku, meanwhile, had managed to descend the stairs and into the street. He was now strolling slowly along the pavement with his eyes downcast and a hood pulled up over his head. He didn't want to be recognized by anyone in the area who went to his school. He had attempted for UA and suffered as a result, which was no secret. Many of his classmates mistreated him physically as well as mentally. His old boyhood friend Katsuki Bakugo, whom he frequently called Kachan, was also in the front of the abusers. Everyone, from their professors to the parents of other children, had commended the boy for his tremendous quirk and said he would make a fantastic hero. Naturally, nobody had the courage to stop the awful attitude that accompanied all of that acclaim. He had become arrogant and conceited. Since no one possessed a stronger quirk than he had, he considered everyone else to be beneath him. Additionally, Katsuki became Izuku's biggest enemy rather than his best friend because Izuku had no quirk at all. Those who were classified as quirkless were now viewed as social outcasts because 80% of the world's population has a quirk, while 20% does not. This implied that geneticism had taken the place of racism and that the term had been abandoned. In the end, it was not a given that a person would get one of their parents' quirks, a combination of the two, or none. Genetics played a key role. This implied that Izuku wasn't actually at fault. It found out that his father, Hisashi, was part of a long line of quirkless people. He didn't even have a very powerful quirk. Even though he loved his father, he had the impression that the guy hoped Izuku would inherit some of both his and his mother's quirks. Since pyrokinesis was uncommon, even a mild case would be considered impressive. Although they weren't uncommon, flame quirks were never pointless. But when Izuku was brought in for his quirk analysis and declared quirkless due to an additional joint in his little toe, everything came to a screeching halt. The situation had gotten worse after that. Katsuki had turned into the epitome of a bully in the playground on steroids because to his potent explosion quirk. Izuku took it upon himself to confront him, and as a result, all of his bullying was directed at the oddball youngster who didn't know where he belonged. He could still feel the fire from each explosion that Katsuki's palms generated, interspersed with vile phrases like insect, stepping stone, and maybe worst of all, Deku. Another way to interpret Izuku's name in kanji was Deku, which changed it to a word that indicated worthless. Additionally, Izuku purposefully formed a negative self-perception after enduring the Ashen Blonde's anger for 10 years. Things had become worse even after he was accepted to Aldera Middle School. The school's teachers were more interested in the fact that one of their pupils had an exceptionally strong quirk and was striving for UA than they were in the fact that one of their students was quirkless. Academy. Katsuki was devastated to learn that Izuku was also making his way to the same school. Every day that passed, Izuku returned home with fresh cuts, scrapes, bruises, and burn marks. Not so long ago, Katsuki had suggested, if you're so desperate for a quirk, why not take a swan dive off the roof and wish for one in your next life? Izuku became aware at that moment that Katsuki Bakugo had lost all resemblance to his old comrade Kachan. Izuku thought to himself, he's more of a villain than a hero, now. As he strolled down the street while thunder rolled overhead, he noticed storm clouds drifting slowly across the city when he looked up. When the first drop of rain fell on his cheek, he moaned and said, "Just my luck." He could hear footsteps scuffing the pavement and then the sound of labored breathing. "Hey you, kid." Izuku whirled around to see a man sprinting in his direction. "Kid. You seen a lil girl?" he said from under a surgical mask as he held out a picture. "Looks like this." He skidded to a stop directly behind him, gasping for air. When Izuku glanced at the photo, he saw a little girl with white hair, thin skin, and a small horn on the right side of her head. Then Izuku turned to face the man. In addition to the medical mask covering his face, he was wearing gloves, a heavy overcoat, and dark glasses. Izuku was positive he could make out the outline of a gun holster hidden behind the coat at his side. Additionally, he detected a slight whiff of alcohol and cigarette smoke emanating from the man. He was relieved that he didn't have to lie because he was terrible at it. Izuku just shrugged and replied, "Sorry, you're the first person I've run into." Additionally, it appeared that he would not want to interact with this individual. "Damn it," the man snarled and pushed the photo back into his pocket. "Boss is gonna kill me," he murmured to himself as he raced as the rain started to fall, not caring that Izuku might hear him. Izuku then kept an eye on him as he turned the corner of the street and made sure he had a certain invention in his pockets. In fact, he did, so he pulled it out and fastened it to the palm and inside of his right wrist. He had called it the web shooter, and it was intended to be a weapon for capture. It was as strong as steel cables and, as its name implied, spewed strong, sticky ropes of a web-like substance that adhered to almost anything and was almost impossible to remove without spreading it. He reasoned that it would be helpful if he encountered any more difficulties after his run-in with the alleged shooter. Furthermore, he was definitely not in the mood to deal with armed goons. He put his sleeve over the device and carried on walking, just before a small body stumbled out of the alley and collided with his legs. Supaidaemon for once, the usually shy Inko Midoriya was bare her teeth back at the Midoriya home. "I've put up with that boy of yours for years, Mitsuki, and only because my baby wanted to see the good in him," she said in a half-sobbing voice. "But after hearing that he practically tried to bait my Izuku into suicide is beyond any amount of reasoning or patience I can muster." "Don't you worry, Inko," she replied, glaring at her son, who was sitting on the couch wearing headphones. "I'm going to make sure that my little brat knows exactly what he's done this time." Mitsuki Bakugo, who was similarly enraged, agreed with her over the phone. "Let him know that I'm extremely close to pressing charges against him," Mitsuki, Inko said. "I know we've been friends for years, but this is too much for me to put up with. If I see even a hint of a scorch mark on Izuku from this point on, Katsuki will face the consequences. I'm going to talk to him right now. You just take care of Izuku, alright?" Mitsuki looked at her son, who clearly hadn't heard a word she had said. "You better believe he will," she exclaimed. Of course. After hanging up the phone, The mom strode to her son's seat and yanked his headphones away. It was Katsuki Bakugo, she yelled. What the hell, you old hag? Katsuki yelled back at his mother, startling him, but he promptly received a hard slap across the face. His father, Masaru, overheard everything and decided to spend some time hiding behind his newspaper. His wife, meantime, was staring down at their son's astonished expression. Did you really try baiting Izuku into jumping off the school roof? She yelled at her stunned son. Don't you dare take that tone with me, you brat. With a growl, Katsuki realized, why that worthless? Don't you dare try to put all of this on him, you little bastard. Mitsuki glared down at him, tears welling up in her eyes, before his mother backhanded him on his opposite cheek before he could continue. Do you know how much I want to call UA right now and have them kick you off their roster? Mitsuki said. You wouldn't dare. She roared directly into his face. I should have known some bullshit like this would happen after you got such a big head because of that quirk of yours. But I never knew that you were such an asshole that you'd try to openly bait someone to commit suicide. She grabbed him by his shirt and said, don't you go telling me what I will or won't do, either. Katsuki's voice was starting to falter as he attempted to speak. But it didn't sit well with his mother. No, not another word. She yelled, then poked her finger into his chest. I'm going to be calling the teachers at UA to let them know exactly what you've done, so help me if they kick you out, then I say good for them, she yelled, leaning over him. To think that I used to be proud of you, she sighed, her voice finally becoming quiet. Now I can barely stand to look at you. As the boy turned away, she said, you know, you and Izuku always loved seeing All Might in action, and that made you both do your best to become just like him. She shook her head. It could have been a slap in the face, but it wasn't. His mother was still holding the child with her hair, and get this straight, young man, if you go near Izuku to do anything more than to apologize, both his mother and I are prepared to have charges brought up against you, understand? She let him go. If you see Izuku, the first thing out of your mouth had better be I'm sorry, and you'd better mean it. Buster. Not a single singed hair, not a single piece of scorched clothing should be seen on that boy ever again. Do I make myself clear? His mouth became a narrow line as he turned his head away from her. Katsuki. Mitsuki said, reaching out and grabbing him by the chin, making him turn to face her. At last, he nodded slightly and said, yes, Mom. Good, she murmured, and pointing to the door, Mitsuki moved back and nodded. Now, leave here for a bit. I need to cool down, and it'll be easier if you're not here. And take an umbrella, it's supposed to rain, he said, nodding as he made his way to the door. Without saying anything, he grabbed an umbrella from next to the door and left. With a groan, the woman and her husband walked over to the couch and sank onto the seat. How did I not see this sooner? Mitsuki moaned, palming her face. How? Masaru folded up his paper and said, you mean how did we not see it sooner? Remember, parenting is typically a two-person job, and I haven't been keeping up my side of the work. And I never listened. Look where that's gotten him, now. What if they really do kick him out for this? Mitsuki asked, half smiling at him. True, but you always told me that we needed to curb that attitude of his, she replied. Masaru nodded. We do what any parents would do, he stated, we beg, and we plead, and then we promise to give him every available counseling session that they could make available. He exhaled, our son isn't too far gone that he can't be brought back, Mitsuki, he just needs to be brought down a few pegs. How do we do this? Mitsuki said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Try a few dozen or so pegs. One step at a time, he said, squeezing her shoulders as he kissed the side of her head just above her ear. Spiderman rain was falling quickly and heavily by the time Katsuki reached the streets under his parents' apartment. It's not my fault that that useless Deku keeps chasing a fantasy that will never come true, he thought angrily. I can't believe this. That contributed to his intense hatred of him. For as long as he had known him, the thin teenager had acted like a hero despite the fact that he had no quirk at all. But Izuku had always treated him like a friend, regardless of his attempts to put distance between them. Why am I acting this way? With a growl, he kicked the sopping wet ground, creating a tiny splash. Why should I care what he does when he's simply a quirkless loser? When a girl was accidentally splashed by Katsuki's kick, she exclaimed, hey, dude, what the crap? Katsuki simply growled as he went past, determined to ignore her, but something stabbed him in the skull, and the next thing he knew, his head was throbbing crazily loudly. Hey, jackass, when you do something like that, you usually apologize. What the hell's your problem, bitch? Katsuki rounded on her after swatting at the back of his skull. The girl put her fists on her hips and gazed at him without fear. The female stared at him and pointed what appeared to be earphone jacks at him. "What's my problem?" She snapped at him. "That's my problem, asshole. My problem is the fact that some dickhead wasn't watching what the hell he was doing and just kicked a gallon of muddy water all over me." "Who are you calling an asshole?" Katsuki said, triggering tiny bursts that resembled firecrackers with his free hand. "Go ahead, idiot, use your quirk," she shouted, glaring down at the boy's flaming hands. "My family's friends have a lot of lawyers, and I bet they'd have a field day with someone like." It wasn't thunder, but a tremendous cracking sound reverberated through the streets. When the girl heard it, she jumped and looked shocked, as did Katsuki. Was that a gunshot? 2 more shots were fired before Katsuki could respond, and then a young girl screamed. "Shit!" The ashen-haired teenager sprinted into the streets without his umbrella, yelling profanities as the stinging rain saturated his palms and wiped away any accumulated nitro sweat. The girl yelled, "Hey," and started running after him, her feet splattering. Katsuki screamed, "Just stay out of this," as the youngster glanced back over his shoulder for a while. "You'll only get in my way." He was already ignoring everything else when the girl screamed something at him. "I'll disprove her. I'm not a bad guy. Let me show her." After his mother had told him all of those things, his mind was racing with all the ways that this could benefit him and improve his reputation in her eyes. What the hell? The blonde slid to a halt, almost colliding with the figure before he recognized a sopping wet mop of greenish-black hair. Deku. Followed another shot as a figure staggered out of an alley with a wrapped bundle in their arms. "Kachan," Izuku said, looking up at Katsuki's voice, his face paler than usual, and his expression couldn't have been more relieved. "Don't call me that, idiot," he said as the teenager staggered near him, panting heavily. "And what's all that shooting about?" he shouted of the lad. "Who's dumb enough to start shit like that in my neighborhood?" The usage of the nickname made a vein on the blonde's head pulse. "Wait up." The girl was clutching his umbrella after catching up to him. "Jerk! You could have waited for me," she yelled at him through her dripping wet bangs, her garments soaking wet from the soaking he'd given her and now from the rain. "What if you needed help? Do you even have a phone?" "And I told you to stay out of this," said Katsuki as he rounded on her. Izuku saw that the girl had a fair skin, short dark hair, and her quirk. She raced forward upon seeing the red spots on Bakugo's t-shirt and exclaimed, "Hey, are you bleeding?" before hurling the umbrella at him. Her eyes were wide. Katsuki then saw that Izuku had one hand clamped into his left side, which was crimson and had blood seeping through the fingers. "Holy shit, you've been shot." The teenager from Explosion yelled, "He's what?" Katsuki scowled as he removed a section of the jacket and noticed a set of scared small red eyes staring back at him. Izuku brushed her hands away with a trembling smile and murmured, "Please don't worry about me," before pushing his bundled-up jacket toward Katsuki. "It's her we need to worry about." It would be an understatement to say that the explosive youngster was stunned. "Okay, Deku, what the actual hell?" he asked, glancing at the wounded teen. "What's with this kid, and who the fuck shot you?" No time to explain, Izuku shook his head, looking as if the action had hurt him. "The guy that's chasing us won't be too far behind me, but he's only after me." He pushed the girl into his arms and said, "You take her, and get her to the police station. I'll lead the guy away." Katsuki and the girl looked down at the child he was now holding as she reached out a tiny bandaged hand to latch onto Izuku's soaked shirt. Then the three of them heard a small, terrified voice stutter out, "And no." Her tiny voice was filled with fear and desperation. "Please, don't go. He'll kill you," she begged him, her eyes wide and watery. "He always kills the people that are nice to me. I don't want you to die." "Don't worry," Izuku said, maintaining a calm tone for the young girl. "I'm not going to die. If there's one thing I'm actually good at, it's finding a way to get through anything." Izuku simply smiled as he reached up and patted her on the head. "You want to be a hero so much, well here's your chance." He then turned to face Katsuki and said, "Get her out of here." As Katsuki was about to dispute, the green-haired teenager grabbed him by the shoulders and shoved him. "I said get out of here," he yelled more firmly, then turned to face the girl and said, "You had better go, too." She returned Katsuki his umbrella and said, "And you should get to a hospital." "Look, I don't know what's going on," she said, glancing down at his side where blood was streaming freely between his fingers, "but I'm not going to leave someone behind when they're hurt this terribly." "There's a clinic not far from here," Katsuki growled, between the two of them. "It's small, but they should be able to patch him up enough to get him to a hospital," she said, raising her eyebrows. "I'll take the kid to the police, and see if I can send some help." He then glared at the injured boy and said, You just try not to die on me, you damn nerd, or I'll kill you. Before heading toward the clinic they both knew. Izuku nodded slowly and murmured, got it. His smile was faint and twisted. He slipped once, but the girl caught him by the ribs before he could fall to the ground, causing him to wince. Sorry, she murmured, attempting to firmly grasp him without hurting him. Just let me help you, okay? She asked. You'd be safer if you went with them, Izuku said, shaking his head and gesturing to Katsuki. Besides, I don't want you getting mixed up in my mess. Katsuki's head had a pulsating vein. Well, thanks a lot for getting me involved. Ya loser, the other kid yelled before turning to face the girl. Keep the idiot alive, alright? He said. Okay. Come on, the girl said to the hurt boy as the rain started to get heavier. We need to go. The rain should wash away the blood trail. The girl laughed a little before leading them down the street. Izuku was led along without arguing. Glancing back over his shoulder at the two of them, Katsuki hurried along the street with the young girl nestled against his chest and said, Damn it, Deku, don't you dare die on me. Not until I've apologized. Spiderman as he pulled out his cell phone a few streets away, the man who had been pursuing Izuku and the girl scowled. Boss, I got bad news, the thug muttered, hiding under an awning. The kid got snatched up. Some teenager ran off with her. The man on the other end asked, Where did they go? What prefecture? The man sighed, I don't know how she made it this far, but she managed to get all the way to Mustafar City, he stated. You know that place near Shizuoka? That far? What the hell were the others thinking? Came a growl over the receiver. I don't know, boss, I only got the notice about half an hour before I ran into that little rat that snatched her, the criminal said. Listen, boss, I hate to sound like a jackass, but I think I'm gonna need some help. You got any contacts with the police in this area? Unfortunately not, said the man. It's fine for now. Just let it go. We have enough of her cells to work with for now. In the meantime, keep your eyes open for the brat, and keep me updated. The moment you see even a strand of that girl's hair, you call me right away, understand? If I'm lucky, that might not be too much longer, the thug said, nodding. I nailed the brat that took her with a 9mm. Hollow point. He burst out laughing. He should be bleeding out anytime. The man remarked, well, at least you got the little bastard to pay. Spiderman normally, Kyoka Jiro, who despises nudity, would have turned neon red when he saw Izuku without a shirt on, but he was extremely fit for his age, possibly because of a strength-enhancing quirk, and his body was covered in scars. More scars than she imagined someone outside of the military, pro-hero work, or any other hazardous occupations could have. Dr. Tsubasa said, You're in bad shape, young man, when examining the boy's side gunshot wound. If this bullet had gone even a quarter of an inch in either direction, you'd be short a lung, or possibly paralyzed. The youngster flinched as he sutured the wound, and the girl scowled at the physician. You seriously need to work on your bedside manner, doc, she gasped. The guy just risked his life for a little girl, and you're telling him he was damned lucky to make it this far? Tsubasa peered through his odd-looking specs at the girl. He smeared alcohol over the spot, causing the youngster to hiss. That's not what I meant at all, my dear, he continued. I'm actually quite impressed that a boy his age could take such damage without a type of healing quirk. According to Kyoka, well, whatever his quirk is, it must be doing something to help him if he's not bawling his eyes out right now. The boy's face contorted in a kind of half-smile at the compliment. As if he were about to cry, the youngster said, well. The boy flinched when the doctor replied, Oh, Izuku doesn't have a quirk at all, young lady, as if to say, which is why I'm so impressed. You don't have a quirk? The girl asked, her voice rising in pitch, but I saw you at the UA entrance examens. For Izuku, who saw a new light in the girl's eyes instead of the disgust or hatred he had grown accustomed to from his harsh treatment. Izuku put up his scarred hands and remarked, with a feeble laugh, Well, I did okay on the written part, but I couldn't break very many of the robots. Impressed, she remarked, but, still, that was a pretty ballsy thing to do. Going to one of the cupboards, the doctor snorted and exclaimed, HMPH, ballsy isn't the word I would use, just to let you know, he remarked, pausing as he took out a disgusting green liquid. After giving the boy a brief glance, he nodded and stated, a little cocktail of antibiotics and a small amount of steroids, and you should be fine in a few weeks if those stitches hold up. He then took out a syringe. Oh boy. The girl said, hissing in simulated anguish as she saw the needle. What? Inquired Izuku. As the man crept up behind him, she stumbled, Oh, it's nothing, I was just thinking that I forgot to tell you my name. Kyokajiro, and I gotta say, you're pretty brave out there when Tsubasa poked him. Yow. Izuku threw himself a good 3 feet from the table. Oh. Kyoka flinched as Izuku gave the doctor a feeble gaze while he laughed. A little warning would have been nice, the boy moaned. I did say that you would be getting a mix of antibiotics and a light steroid, but I didn't say how you'd get it, the physician laughed. Now, I must warn you that you will feel a bit feverish as a mild side effect, but that will pass quickly, he said as the kid got up to begin wrapping bandages around his waist. I've also had the nurse call your mother. She should be here in a few minutes, so if the young lady wouldn't mind keeping your company for a little while longer, I'll have you moved to a recovery room so you can rest, and get you hooked up to an IV to replenish the lost blood. You must be feeling quite dizzy by now. After applying the bandages, Izuku nodded and murmured, okay. Thank you, Miss Jiro. The girl shifted to bear his weight. As the lad gave her a startled look, Kyoka flushed and replied, Jay, just call me Kyoka. You've been bleeding on me for a little while, so I'd say that at least puts us on a first-name basis, Kyoka added. Spiderman. After the two adolescents had left the examination room, Tsubasa took out his phone, locked the door, and said, Master, I have some news for you. A suave voice asked, Do you, now? What do you have to report? Tsubasa laughed. Do you recall my little experiment with the devil's breath, and its effects on animals? The person on the other end of the phone laughed. Yeah, I do, the master replied. I remember that you were testing it on various arachnid species, mainly spiders, weren't you? Indeed, and I've just tested the mutated venom on a young man that just came back into my old clinic here in Mustafar, he said as he waved his mustache. Poor boy was shot, it seems, with a hollow point, no less. What I didn't tell him was that that bullet tore up some of his vital organs, and he would have been dead by the morning since I didn't have the right equipment here to treat such a wound. However, if the venom acts as it should, then the boy should be able to regenerate within a few hours of the injection. The teacher laughed. Still trying to make up for not finding the cell regeneration quirk in time, are we? Can you blame me, master? You are, technically, blind after all. Tsubasa murmured. And it was I that failed to heal you in time. The master was asked, what other side effects do you expect? Tsubasa thought for a moment, if it's a negative reaction, then he won't last the night. The venom I used was from a mutated black widow I procured from overseas, after all. However, if the effects are positive, as I've said, he'll heal, and be right as rain by morning. He continued, though I don't know if there will be any other effects. When testing the venom on rats, they seem to take on arachnid-like traits. One even grew a few extra limbs. This boy is quirkless, however, and the first human subject I've ever tested it on, so I'm quite excited to see what comes of it. As am I, my old friend, as am I, the master said. Will you please keep me updated? But of course, Tsubasa replied. By the way, have you made any progress with your little spy? Why yes, as a matter of fact, I have, the instructor laughed jocularly, adding, the boy was quite willing to comply after I had a little conversation with his parents. Spiderman. So, Kyoka continued, wrapping one of her jacks around her finger as she sat next to Izuku's hospital bed, you tried to get into the hero course without a quirk. I know it was dumb, but I had to try, Izuku, who was now lying back on his bed with a bag of blood attached to his arm, said with a sheepish nod. I've wanted to be a hero all my life. I even took up a martial arts class and physical training to get my body in shape in time for the test. It shows, the girl remarked quietly, having witnessed a good deal of his toned chest and abs during his surgery, and she had to concede that the kid was attractive whether or not he had scars. He would be adorable if he weren't so incredibly pale. She scowled as a faint haze of perspiration appeared on his forehead. You're perspiring a bit, she said, grabbing a cloth from the bedside table and wiping his face. It must be the fever the doctor told us about. Izuku smiled a little awkwardly. I do feel a little warm, the youngster said, blushing. KK Kyoka? He stammered as she took back her hand and waved it slightly. Kyoka was wiping the perspiration from his face when she put her hand against his forehead, causing him to yell a bit at the contact. Maybe I should go get a nurse, or something, she exclaimed, her face displaying concern. Geez, you're on fire. Izuku scowled and said, really, I feel fine, but in reality, he felt as though something was wrong with him, and it wasn't only the bullet hole in his side. He believed that the fact that a very attractive girl was taking care of him might have contributed to the near-electric shockwave that was sent over his skin by the mere contact of her cool palm. As she walked toward the door, Kyoka shook her head and said, you don't look it, before the girl obstinately stood up. Look, you just lay back and rest, and I'll see if a nurse can come in and check up on you, alright? She said. I wanted to call my folks to let them know where I am, anyway. The girl left the room and snuggled up on him while he clutched at his stomach, and Izuku nodded, feeling a little strange and not believing his voice. You. He slumped over the side of the bed as the heat from his forehead started to radiate throughout his body and his heart pounded quickly. His stomach heaved, spilling its contents. What's happening to me? He moaned in agony once more before rolling over and spilling his body off the bed. As the monitors and IVs detached from his body, the gear he was connected to began beeping loudly. Just as Kyoka burst back into the room with a nurse close behind her, his moans transformed into cries of anguish. Since turning became a hero, Toshinori Yagi has never felt so hypocritical in his life. His career was characterized by hypocrisy since, while he witnessed the whole UA during the admission exam, he saw a young man he had met on the street and begged him to state that, despite the fact that he had a quirk, he might be a hero. In order to ensure the boy's safety, he had, of course, told him no in no small words. He had even gone so far as to show him the severe wound he had recently sustained, which was now causing him to retire quickly. It was extremely awful to witness the young man's quirkless hands pound, bruise, and bleed themselves all over the mechanical villains during the practical, but he had aced the written exam. When it was revealed that the youngster was quirkless, most of the teachers vetoed his acceptance out of worry for his personal safety, even though he had actually achieved numerous rescue points and had managed to damage a few of the robots to earn a few combat points. As a result, Toshinori Yagi, the man who is regarded as All Might and the greatest hero of all time, had his aspirations to become a hero completely dashed and a quirkless version of himself disintegrate. The boy had created a nearly lethal weapon in less than 30 minutes during the support course portion of the test, and it worked flawlessly. Powerloader himself had claimed that if he had been permitted to use it, it would have been strong enough to put All Might on his back. It is true that he had argued for the boy's acceptance to Principal Nezu after witnessing his performance. However, it was futile. Despite his understanding of the man's reasoning, Nezu was determined that the boy would not be permitted to enroll in the hero course, regardless of Toshinori's assurances, as the fundamental reason was that Izuku Midoriya's body could not withstand the demanding training that UA put its pupils through. At that, Toshinori scowled. All things considered, he was still suffering through the torment he had gone through to acquire his own strength. He thought to himself, I could have helped him if I had simply noticed that from the beginning. He would have been perfect. Compared to others, his quirk, known as One for All, was extremely unique. The ability to be handed on to another, a sort of successor, to inherit the power of the previous wielder and strengthen it for the next inheritor makes it unique. Standing outside the police station, the man sighed to himself, and I spurned the perfect successor. No matter how hard I tried to make it up to him, he probably wouldn't talk to me now. His longtime acquaintance, a detective named Naomasa Tsukachi, greeted him as he entered the building. The man stood by a young man with ashen blonde hair who appeared to be angry. He grinned upon seeing the shrunken hero and said, "Ah, Toshinori, I'm glad you were able to make it so quickly." As he shook his friend's hand, Toshinori said, "Of course," with a skeletal smile. "You sounded so urgent over the phone that I just had to rush right over," he said, turning to face the young man. "And you seem to be in quite fine company." This young man was the top-scoring student on UA's practical exam. "And just how the hell do you know that?" The blonde snapped at the fellow. "I'm a bit of a talent scout for the school's recommendations," Toshinori remarked shyly, not to be put off by the boy's antagonistic demeanor. "Along with yourself, the school seems to have quite the impressive crop this year." "Tisk," the brunette grumbled, "it won't do them any good, 'cause I'm gonna be the best they've ever had since All Might." Toshinori simply chuckled at the boy's self-assurance. He wouldn't be well served by taking him down any time soon. He was aware of the youngster's explosion quirk and knew it was highly useful in combat after witnessing the boy in action. Only if he changed his mentality would he succeed. He turned to face his companion and asked, "But why on earth are you here at the police station, my boy? He's not gotten into trouble, has he?" "I was just finishing up with questioning him on an incident that he was involved in," the detective continued, shaking his head. "Not at all," he said, as the child simply crossed his arms and turned his head away. "You see, a friend of his." Exclaiming, "He's not my friend," the blonde exploded. Naomasa corrected himself quickly. His quirk responded slightly to the boy's story, and he said with a hint of humor, "Acquaintance of his was involved in what seems to be a long-term kidnapping and child abuse case." "Dear Lord, anything but that." Toshinori palmed his face and lowered it to his chin. He spoke primarily to himself, but the detective and the blonde could hear him clearly enough. "And where is this furry acquaintance?" According to Mr. Bakugo here, he suffered a gunshot when he encountered the aforementioned child, the detective said, frowning. He was in a clinic in the Shizuoka district, Toshinori said, looking at him bewildered. Fortunately, he ran into Mr. Bakugo and another youngster, who accompanied him to the clinic to make sure he got there intact, while Mr. Bakugo took charge of the child and brought her to us. The blonde boy winced as the detective went on to explain. His expression was extremely grave, but it seems that boy is quirkless, and the wound that he received was very bad. He gently shook his head. It was reported to the station about an hour ago that he was transferred to the local hospital because a severe fever developed soon after he was treated. He breathed deeply, but with the sudden manner in which the fever developed, we're thinking that the wound turned septic, or that the bullet that he was shot with may have been laced with a type of poison. Toshinori gaped at the man, his brow rising to just below his hairline. Poison? He said. The detective said, and that would have been bad enough, but the doctors have reported that they've also found trace amounts of devil's breath in his system. Naomasa nodded slowly as he recalled reading the reports. The doctors found a very large amount of Black Widow venom in the boy's system, he said, the man's face growing more serious by the second. Yeah, now you see why we thought that he'd been poisoned. As he remembered running into the youngster, the lad growled, like hell he was, before turning to face the detective. He was weak from blood loss when I ran into him, but he wasn't acting like he'd been poisoned. Toshinori shook his head and hummed. That's something to think about, he muttered thoughtfully. Devil's breath is an extremely fast-acting virus, he said, rubbing his chin as he considered the situation. No, if the bullet was coated with the virus, then he wouldn't have made as far as the clinic, no matter how close it was. Naomasa breathed a sigh of relief. Well, however it got into him, he's fortunate that his immune system seems to be fighting it off, said he. From what the doctors are saying, the boy, even though he's quirkless, is also pretty strong. Bakugo was grumbling next to him. The girl that was with him stated that he was only showing signs of a severe fever before she left to phone her parents and look for a nurse to check him over, but when she returned with the nurse, the boy had fallen out of bed, vomited all over the floor and was drenched in sweat, which is the reason he was rushed to the hospital. His mother was supposedly able to meet them there after being notified. The girl is still with him, as far as I've been told. Feeling that they had strayed from the main subject, Toshinori inquired, what about the child you mentioned? The poor little thing wasn't hurt, were they? The child, a 6-year-old little girl, was. Well, she was unharmed. But that doesn't mean she isn't hurt. The detective's face contorted into a grimace of utter wrath. He made a small gesture toward Bakugo and said, her arms and legs were wrapped in gauze, so I had Mr. Bakugo unwrap them to make sure that there were no injuries. His teeth were clenched tightly as he said, both of her arms and legs were covered in scars, and they appeared surgical in nature, which meant that she wasn't just harmed, she was surgically tortured by her captors. He reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose, saying, that poor little girl, she's so introverted that she's terrified to let anyone but this young man near her. That's not all there is. The boy's voice was chilly with rage as his hands began to smoke and his palms released the nitro sweat that drove his quirk. He's right, Naomasa stated in a voice that seemed to be shaking. She's psychologically damaged to the point that she believes that everything that's happened to her and her savior is her fault, and that the bad people will find him and kill him right in front of her as a punishment. My God, Toshinori said, shaking his head, do we have any leads on who these people might be? Had it not been for the young guy in their midst, he would have shed his skeletal form and bulked out to his natural condition of all might in wrath. Regretfully, Naomasa and the youngster both shook their heads. The little girl says her captors all wore masks that looked like bird faces. He raised his nose and tapped his side. I assume that what she's talking about is most likely a beak, so I can only assume that the masks that they were wearing may have been plague masks. Toshinori scowled thoughtfully and shook his head. Anyway, I think I would like to meet the young man that saved that little girl. Do you know his name, by chance? He said. I don't know of any active villain groups that don't wear such masks, but I know someone who might know, he said with a heavy sigh. Though I am loath to call him. He and I did not part on amicable terms. It's Izuku Midoriya, the youngster said. He's been my neighbor and my classmate for as long as I can remember. Toshinori's expression was as though someone had just stabbed him in the chest with a piece of ice. With a heavy burden of shame, he thought, Izuku Midoriya. I should have known. Spiderman without a car, Inko Midoriya had gotten to the hospital as quickly as she could, and she was positive that the cab fare would cost her a lot of money given how she handled her finances. That didn't stop her from reaching her kid as soon as possible, though. However, when she got there, she discovered her kid in excruciating pain. By strapping him to the hospital bed and giving him sedatives, the doctors and nurses were trying their best to prevent him from hurting himself anymore, but whatever was wrong with him was causing so much anguish that the sedatives were ineffective. She noticed the young girl who had accompanied him, as well as a couple she thought were her parents, outside the room where he was being held. Inko had little choice but to watch the nurses tend to her thrashing son while she engaged them in animated conversation. In order to avoid disturbing the girl and her family, she took a seat outside the room across from them. She then began to pray fervently that her son would get better soon. Dear God, I entrust you with the protection of my only son, who has suffered greatly. In silence, she prayed. Reach out your hand and save him from the pain that plagues him. I ask that you console him to lessen the misery he has undergone at my hands and that of others. In order for me to be my son's mother once more, please allow me to be forgiven for the hurt I have caused him over the years. Mrs. Midoriya, are you doing all right? She asked, noticing the girl staring down at her with concern on her face. As the girl offered Inko a handkerchief, she nodded and said, I'm fine, thank you, dear. Unaware that she had been crying, she took it and dabbed at her eyes. It was typically evident with her and her son since their eyes tended to leak tears like waterspouts. She grinned up at the girl and said, I was told that you helped my son when he was trying to get to the clinic. Thank you for that, too. I really don't think I did anything special, she remarked, a little embarrassed. All I really did was keep him company. She shook her head, the jacks on the ends of her earlobes tapping together. With a smile, the anxious mother told the girl, and that is more special to me than you can imagine, adding, my son has always had a low opinion of himself since he was pronounced quirkless, and he doesn't really have many friends for the same reason. So something as simple as keeping him company when he's hurt is more than enough to raise you up in my eyes. The girl's parents moved up behind her. That's our little girl, the girl's father replied, smiling and placing his hand on her shoulder. She comes off with a bad attitude, but she's got a heart of gold. Dad! The child exclaimed, flushed, pushing her father away, not cool. Their antics made Inko smile, and she wished her son and her husband could have shared such a bond. At that moment, a doctor walked out of the room, his coat rearranged on his shoulders, and he looked really unkempt. As he glanced from Inko to Mrs. Jiro, he said, could I ask which one of you ladies is Mrs. Inko Midoriya? Inko stood up and moved forward, saying, that's me. The man sighed and straightened his tie. Thank you, he said. Regarding your son. Well, as you've probably seen and heard, he said, pointing to the room where the nurses were still holding the boy in place. Whatever he's been infected with has been causing him an extreme amount of pain, he said, shaking his head in complete bewilderment. And I'm afraid we've expended the amount of sedatives we can safely give him. Whatever you're giving him doesn't look like it's doing much for him, Kyoka said, peering into the room where Izuku was struggling to keep his composure while yelling and flailing. Inko whimpered anxiously as the doctor went on, and while we've managed to stabilize him for the time being, whatever's happening to him, he shook his head, we have no choice but to let it run its course. The doctor nodded, the fever he's suffering from is burning through everything we've given him at an alarming rate, he sighed. All we've managed to do is keep his temperature just barely low enough to keep it from causing permanent damage. This is definitely more serious than the gunshot wound our daughter told us about, Kyoka's mother said, putting her hands on Inko's shoulders and asking, don't you have any ideas about what's causing this? I don't think that this is a side effect of being shot, he muttered as the doctor glanced between the two women and reached up to pinch his brow. What little blood samples we've been able to safely take from him have shown that he's... Well, I can't say that it would cause this sort of reaction, either, but there was a frightening amount of spider venom in his blood. Inko's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped, specifically venom from a black widow. As Kyoka's mother held her up by supporting her shoulders, Inko made a choked sound in her throat at the mention of the deadly arachnid. In an effort to calm her, she exclaimed, Now, dear, there's anti-venom for such a thing. Inko smiled appreciatively at the woman. As Inko's head snapped up at him, the doctor gave them both a disapproving look. I wish that I could tell you that it would help, he said, adding, but the venom wasn't the only thing that we've found. He then looked at the woman dejectedly and said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Midoriya, but we've discovered devil's breath in your son's system. Inko stopped. She was aware of devil's breath's effects on afflicted individuals because she worked as a nurse. Kyoka and her mother barely managed to grasp her before her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, saying, Oh, dear God. Jesus Christ, Doc. Kyoka's dad yelled, try being a little more sensitive, will ya? The poor woman's already stressed out enough. As she gave Inko a reassuring back rub, Kyoka's mother worriedly inquired, he's going to be all right, isn't he? The doctor sighed, as if perplexed, and said, in all honesty, amidst everything he's being put through, the boy should have expired long before now. Inko made a strangled sound, drawing more glares from the Jiro family. When he was shot, the bullet all but destroyed his liver, and then there's the added effects of the venom, which we believe is what's causing his suffering now, and the virus in his system. He continued, Inko becoming paler with each sentence. However, from what we've seen, the fever is causing his body to sweat out the toxins while the damage done by the gunshot is rapidly healing. Both Kyoka and Inko stared at him in disbelief. The boy's body is fighting back on all fronts like. Well, it's almost as if he has a type of hyper-regeneration quirk. When Inko finally calmed down enough to speak, she said, and even if he did, it doesn't explain how, because no one in our family even has anything close to that type of quirk. The woman looked absolutely shocked by the doctor's statement. But my baby doesn't even have a quirk, she sobbed. I should know, I've treated his injuries from bullies for years. When he lifted his sleeve to reveal a tiny red mark in the shape of a hand on his left wrist, the doctor nodded and said, your son may have been quirkless before now, Mrs. Midoriya, but from what we have observed in the last half hour at the least, he has exhibited signs of enhanced strength, rapid regeneration, and what seems to be a form of bioelectricity. Whatever's happening to your son, at this very moment, it has activated his dormant quirk genes. Quirk genes? Repeated Inko. Everyone has these genes, said the physician, whether or not they are born with active quirk genes, or inactive ones are a complete coin toss. However, depending on how strong the genes are in an offspring is determined by how strong they are from the parents. Since your quirk and his father's quirk are, technically, weak, his genes were inactive at birth, making him quirkless. Kyoka questioned, so this virus is making his quirk activate? Not quite, he replied. You see, if his quirk was telekinesis or fire breath like either of his parents, then I would say that the virus caused the quirk to activate as a defense mechanism. He continued, but this young man is displaying multiple abilities that neither one of his parents have, which means that there is another factor at work. My theory is that the spider venom in his system and the virus were introduced simultaneously. Meaning the spider had been infected with the virus before biting him, causing his quirk genes to mutate into what we're seeing now. Aren't we missing something here? Kyoka's mom responded, you said that it was a black widow that bit him, correct? Indeed, and I'm well aware that the species is not indigenous to Japan, the man replied with a scowl. Which begs the question, where did this arachnid come from? That whacked-out doctor that treated his wound jabbed him with some kinda cocktail he said was antibiotics and steroids, but he started feeling sick almost right after he was injected. Kyoka responded quickly, shocking the others with her shout, the clinic. The doctor questioned, why would he do something like poison the young man? Paler by the moment, Inko exclaimed, an experiment? He used my son as a guinea pig? One of the nurses was abruptly flung through the door and slammed into the wall before anyone could say anything. While a second nurse helped her comrade up, the doctor quickly made his way back to the room to help hold the boy before he could do any more harm. Inko felt heartbroken. He's the same man that told us that Izuku was quirkless, she gasped. How could he use my baby like a lab rat? While her father was blubbering next to Inko, Kyoka's mother was already calling the police to report what they had discovered. But a few seconds later a tremendous jolt of electricity sent the doctor hurtling through the door. Spiderman, the clinic where Izuku had received care for his wound, had already closed and the doctor had left by the time the cops arrived. The man's files were gone, and there was no sign of the serum that had been used on Izuku to cause him to suffer as much as he did. Detective Tsukachi, who had a personal stake in the case because Eri, the young child, had repeatedly pleaded for her rescuer, showed up on the scene. Later, when he would go to the hospital with the young girl by his side, the staff would discover that the youngster she so desperately wanted to see had been rendered entirely comatose by excessive dosages of sedatives, but there was little else they could have done. Izuku's body appeared to go into automatic defense mode as a result of his new abilities, and he would lash out at anyone in the area that his body perceived as a threat. Since Izuku was unable to distinguish between friend and foe in his current state, the physicians were forced to employ drastic methods and higher dosages. Little Eri, however, was determined to visit him despite the fact that he was currently a threat to those around him. As a result, she encountered his mother rather than her savior. Eri instantly felt safe with the woman, who was happy to have a diversion from her own son's suffering, and she knew the girl who was with her from when the boy had given her to the noisy boy. She also posed a question that would make Naomasa's life much more difficult in the days ahead while she was being held up to the window to peek inside Izuku's chamber. Is Daddy going to be okay? The father realized that it would be nearly impossible to separate the young girl and boy after that one innocent sentence. particularly considering how reclusive she was as a result of the long-term abuse she had experienced. Unsure of how to respond to the child's inquiry, Inko just smiled and answered, "Yes, dear, your daddy's going to be just fine." The young girl appeared content with this response and dozed off in the woman's arms a short while later. Ultimately, the physicians could only ensure the youngster was reasonably comfortable and let whatever was ailing him have its course. After the investigator ran out of options for what to do with Eri, Inko was requested to take the girl for the night. Since she had been close to the young girl in the brief time she had known her, she was happy to do so. However, she was surprised to see two guests when they were taken back to her house. One was a little white animal, while the other was a skeletal guy with sunken eyes and blonde hair. Knowing both of them, Naomasa introduced them as UA talent scout Toshinori Yagi, and the direct communication between the UA and All Might, Nezu, the principal himself. Before she put the sleeping Eri on Izuku's bed, she called everyone inside. As Toshinori smiled at the abundance of All Might-themed items, the young girl curled up beneath Izuku's blanket. Quite the fanboy, isn't he? Unaware of the stab of remorse she had shot into the man's breast as he picked up one of the handmade pieces of support gear on the child's desk, Inko laughed and said, "Oh, yes, Izuku's admired All Might since he was just a little boy. I can imagine that things haven't been easy while raising such a boy in today's day and age," Nezu sighed. "A child that's born without a quirk must have brought on a great deal of strife." With Nezu's back to her, Inko gave him a sour look as the overly perceptive rodent marveled at the many handwritten messages her son had collected over the years. "Yes, and I'm sure you've heard about Katsuki Bakugo by now." Nodded, "I have, and his mother was quite adamant that should we accept him, that we put the boy through counseling to curb that horrendous attitude of his," he said with a calm voice. "Now, normally, I would have told them that such behavior was intolerable, but seeing as they brought it to my attention before he was enrolled in our school, I agreed to take him in as a student, and put him through therapy. If he doesn't improve, then we will have no choice but to expel him." Toshinori yelled, "Ack," as the gadget he was admiring exploded, spraying him with its contents. "What the heck is this stuff?" he asked, trying to scrape the sticky muck off his face. "Spider webs." Izuku based it on spider's silk, and it's just as strong as steel cables. Inko chuckled once again as she saw the man coated in the substance. "He even made it from cheap and recycled materials so that it wouldn't hurt our budget," she claimed happily. Toshinori complained, "That is something I would like to talk to you both about." Blast it. This stuff is sticky." Inko then waved a spray bottle with the label web dissolvent in his direction. He sprayed himself with the unexpectedly pleasant-smelling chemical that melted the web-like thing away in a matter of seconds after saying, "Thank you, Mrs. Midoriya." "Ahem," he said while releasing himself. "Now, as I was saying, during the practical exam, your son displayed a great deal of what I personally believe it means to be a hero, ma'am, and, though he was unable to earn enough combat points to qualify for the hero course during the practical exam, he did rack himself up quite a few rescue points, which was more than enough to have earned himself a place in the hero course." He did? Inko blinked, stuttering, "Then why wasn't he?" Nezu said, apparently ignoring the woman's resentment, "We can't safely enroll him, ma'am, because he doesn't have a quirk." Although the boy performed exceptionally well on the written tests and in the support and general studies courses, the fact that he doesn't have a quirk. Toshinori reminded the mammalian principal, "There are plenty of students that have quirks that are ill-suited for UA's training courses," the towering blonde said, "and they may as well be quirkless themselves." His eyes hardened into a glare at him, "But you blatantly disregarded the fact that the school has rescue points for those very students, since their quirks aren't suited for combat, and tossed this boy aside purely out of geneticism." Inko scowled at the principal and said, "But the doctors say that Izuku has now developed a quirk, so I would appreciate it if you took this chance to reconsider his acceptance, Principal Nezu." She was concerned that their loud voices might wake the sleeping child. "Thank you for telling me that, Mr. Yagi. I had no idea that the faculty in UA could be so unfair." They both stared at her in disbelief. "A quirk? How?" Nezu inquired, and Inko gave a brief explanation of what had been discovered during her hospital stay. Replied, "She's right, the boy's exhibiting multiple quirk-like abilities, and has been for the entire time." He responded with a sad sigh, "But when we went to apprehend him, this Dr. Tsubasa was already gone, as well as all of his notes, data, or anything we could use against him. First the little girl, and now this." Toshinori snarled, with a hint of rage in his voice. He said, "I was being nice when I pleaded his case before, Nezu, but now I'm threatening. If he still wants it, then this boy will attend UA, and will be placed in the hero course, or else I'll pull all of my funding from the school, and I'll make sure that All Might teaches elsewhere. I assure you that there is no need to go that far, Toshinori, he responded quickly. I'll gladly place the boy in our best class so that he will be made into a fine hero, the mammalian said, looking at him uneasily. Whether he attends UA or decides to go elsewhere, I'd like to make it up to the boy, Toshinori said, grinning and turning to face the boy's mother. Does young Midoriya have a costume design he wanted to use? He said, gesturing to the boy's room. As she glanced at the shelf containing her son's blueprints and notes, Inko bit her lip. Unpredictably, she grabbed a big binder from the row and started leafing through it. She handed him the binder so he and Naomasa could look at the design on the page. I hope that you won't read too much into this, Mr. Yagi, she said, flipping through the pages. His father is a vigilante. But Izuku used to be quite proud of him for that fact, smiling fondly as she recalled watching him draw it out. So he wanted something that resembled his father's suit. Toshinori smirked at the skeletal guy as Naomasa exchanged glances with him. His father, you said? With a proud nod, Inko said, yes, I did. The reason he doesn't come home isn't because he's ashamed of his quirkless son, is it? Naomasa asked, furrowing his brow. Before giving both men a terrified expression, Inko stated, no, it's not. At least that is not what I believe. I haven't spoken with him in so long, but I know that he's doing honest work, now. The investigator was just saying, I'm not here to investigate a vigilante that's been silent for the last 10 years, he stated, but I would like to ask you a few questions at a later time, provided you don't mind talking about him in general? She shook her head and grinned, not at all. Laughed. I'll have to make a few changes and tweaks here and there to make sure it's not too obvious, but I think I can have our company make him an excellent hero suit. Supaidaemon, a familiar figure, was standing over Izuku, drawing blood from his arm, when he blearily opened his eyes in response to an insistent buzzing at the back of his mind. Dr. Tsubasa? Izuku said. He looked down at him and said, not only did you survive having your liver being practically blown to pieces, but the serum I injected you with gave you the gift that you've always wanted. I would suggest that you thank the spider if she were still alive. The doctor nodded. That is the name that I have often used, yes, the man said as he stood up and injected the blood sample into a specimen bottle. As I've said before, I am quite impressed with you, young man. Yes, indeed. Gift? He inquired more precisely. Tsubasa gave him a proud smile and said, yes, my boy, a very special gift. He laughed, put the sample in his pocket, and left the room as Izuku started to relapse into unconsciousness. I'm not sure how far it will extend, but you now have all of the abilities that most spiders have. Though, I highly doubt that you can spin webs of your own. I truly can't wait to see what you're capable of, my little spider boy. Izuku was aware that he had not moved in a long time, but he was unsure of how long he had been gone. His body felt heavier, as though he were being forced into the mattress, and his joints were rigid. He knew that something else was waking him awake since this time there was no buzzing at the back of his skull. Someone was singing, and there was a faint sound and a voice. When he listened to music while using his devices, the sound was completely different from anything he had ever heard before. No, this voice was husky, but it was so divine that he believed he was hearing an angel's voice. He gently opened his eyes to see where the voice was coming from. To his right, and there, sitting beside his bed, was the same girl who had escorted him to the clinic, singing a gentle melody to a drowsy young girl in her lap. He moved his head slightly closer to hear her more clearly, but she must have noticed the movement because she paused her song a moment later and gave him a wide-eyed stare. Holy crap, you're awake. As the young girl blinked drowsily in her arms, Izuku laughed uneasily and said, why yeah, I guess I am, huh? Daddy, Eri said, startled awake by his words and meeting his gaze. Izuku blinked, huh? And the little girl threw herself at him, embracing him as firmly as her skeletal arms would permit. DDD daddy? Yup. Kyoka giggled as she got up from her seat to sit on the edge of the bed. It's what she's been calling you ever since they brought her over to see you, she said, as the boy got up in bed to hold the girl in his lap. Kyoka smiled at the sight of the little girl looking so happy, even when she wasn't smiling. That's going to take some getting used to, Izuku said, laughing a little uncomfortably as the girl cuddled up to him. He added, turning to face the girl, how long have you been here? The girl let out a sigh and asked, today? She shrugged and replied, not long. An hour at most, blushing slightly. But, you've been out cold for a solid week. With a shrill squeak, Izuku said, week? I've been here for a week? With a sniffle, Eri remarked, we came every day, but you wouldn't wake up. Izuku rubbed the little girl's hair and smiled down at her, momentarily forgetting what she had called him a minute earlier. I'm sorry I made you worry about me, sweetie. But I told you that I wouldn't die, didn't I? He asked. You see? I kept my promise. Eri shook her head shyly. You know you had a lot of us pretty darned worried about you, right? Kyoka said, smiling at the two of them. That Bakugo guy comes by every other day, and your mom comes by every evening to see if you've woken up, she said, reaching into her blazer pocket and taking out her phone. Speaking of that, I should probably send her a text to let her know you're up. He saw the girl type and transmit the message using the lengthy jack-like lobes. Izuku gripped Eri and said, So, what did the doctors say was wrong with me? And what about her? Have the police found out anything about her? Kyoka raised her eyebrows. No, as far as I've been told by your mom, all they've been able to find is that Eri technically doesn't exist. She used her fingers to count, no birth certificate, no medical records, and no information on who her parents might be. She sighed, Your mom and I have been taking care of her for the last week, so she's been in pretty good hands. Sighing, Izuku said, That's at least some good news. Yeah, but you're the one that's got everyone's attention, she said. That Dr. Tsubasa guy gave you something that wasn't antibiotics or steroids. It was some kind of spider venom laced with devil's breath. But I should be dead, then, shouldn't I? Izuku asked, staring at her in disbelief. Well, I'm not complaining about you not being dead, Kyoka shrugged, laughing a little. Besides that, from what I heard, you've got yourself a quirk, now. Izuku blinked, recalling something like to a dream in which the doctor stood above him and informed him that he possessed the talents of a spider. Not even a little lightheaded or dizzy, he sat up in bed and put Eri down before he stood up. Hey, don't push your self. Kyoka trailed off as the teenager leapt to the ceiling and squirmed around the tiles like a spider. Okay. From his spot on the ceiling, Izuku could only smile at her. Like a bullet train, the possibilities of his new quirk were racing through his mind. I'm eager to examine this. Considering how much he could write in one of his notebooks, he pondered. Spiderman the good doctor had had plenty of time to examine the blood sample he had drawn from Izuku during the week that he had been comatose. The master had also been very happy with his research's findings. Over the static of a monitor in the man's laboratory, the master inquired, How is our newest subject doing? He's doing quite well, if I do say so myself, master, the doctor said, laughing as he looked away from his project. Introducing the mutated blood to the Nomu's base form has given me quite the impressive little soldier to set loose. He grinned and turned back to the creature in front of him. The thing itself had dark shaggy gray hair all over its body and was easily 7 feet tall. The body was adorned with 6 lengthy arms that ended in enormous, razor-sharp, 3-fingered hands. 6 red eyes peered in all directions from the big, rectangular head. Deadly mandibles with enormous teeth were behind those evil eyes. It's quite possibly my best work, yet, said the physician, I think young Tamura will be pleased with this beast once we enact his plan to kill the symbol of peace. He laughed, with all of those arms, he's quite possibly as strong as All Might. And with the rapid regeneration that the boy's quirk has, it's virtually unstoppable. I see, the master remarked with a laugh. Tell me, what else do you have planned for that sample you took? He asked. I do have something else to show. The doctor sighed and absently twirled his mustache. You see, after I created this advanced mutation Nomu, I decided to do a little more in-depth research into our little spider's DNA. He turned the monitor toward the container and said, and I managed to isolate the most dangerous part of it. As the black substance inside the container lunged at him, he said, What you're seeing here is nothing short of pure, unbridled aggression. There's absolutely no controlling it, even if it finds a host to bond with. My, what a magnificent creation, the ruler said with delight. Whatever you do, Dr. Garaki, do not dispose of this entity. I may find a use for it, yet. Spiderman, after undergoing all the necessary tests to ensure that the devil's breath had permanently left his system, Izuku was released from the hospital just 1 day later. As a precaution, the doctors even gave him a dose of the antiserum they had on hand. Mom, seriously, I feel fine, Izuku stated as they were driving home. The doctors said that I'm back in full health. His mother fussed over him even after he was given a clean bill of health, just like a mother hen over her chick. I know, sweetie, but you can't blame me for worrying like this after everything that's happened, Inko said, letting out a sigh as they returned to their district by train. She smiled down at little Eri, who was standing on the seat to gaze out the train window at the passing buildings. You'd be surprised at what I've had to go through just this last week. The woman grinned when the girl was mentioned. Kyoka told me that you'd been talking to some guy from UA's scouting agency, he added. So what have they been bothering you about? She asked. As she reached over and held Eri in her lap, Inko scowled and said, "Honestly, they've been quite helpful. There's this nice man, a Mr. Toshinori Yagi, who works as a scout for both the school and for the main Tokyo branch of Might Towers out of Minato." Izuku's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the man. "You know him?" Inko asked, looking at her son. He acknowledged, "Yeah, we've met once," as he was aware that the man was actually All Might. "So, what did he do?" With a look of surprise on his face, Inko told him, "He's done a fair amount, dear," and she laughed. "You see, after that first night, when you were admitted to the hospital, he and the UA principal came to visit me. Apparently he was present during the practical exam, and he said that you showed a great deal of potential for the hero course," she said. "He even said that you had earned enough secondary rescue points to be admitted into the school." Izuku gaped at her, saying, I wasn't told anything about that." "That's basically what I said," Inko replied with comprehension. "But the principal said, and Mr. Yagi was quite upset with him because of this, that it was a matter of safety on your part for not taking you into the hero course since, at the time, you didn't have a quirk. So I suppose he stopped your enrollment because of that." Izuku rolled his eyes bitterly and said, "Of course he did. The little rat said as much in his rejection letter." His arm was patted by Inko, who said, "Yes, dear, I know, but as I said, Mr. Yagi was very upset that he did something like ignoring the fact that you should have been admitted for those secondary points you earned," smiling. "He outright threatened to pull funding from the school and send All Might somewhere else to teach." "Teach?" the youngster exclaimed, his eyes growing wide. She cracked up, "That's right, apparently All Might is going to be a teacher at UA starting this year." Eri said, "Grandma, I'm hungry." Izuku's mind was racing when Inko smiled at her and began to ask what she wanted to eat. If All Might is going to lecture at the University of Arizona, the hero course is going to be crazy this year. But why is he attempting to assist me now? He pondered. Is my new quirk the only reason? Or does he harbor resentment for our previous encounter? Eri noted, "Daddy's talking a lot." As her son flushed, Inko laughed and patted her, grandchild, on the head, saying, "Yes, sweetie, he does that." A man in a red hoodie sat across from the small family while they spoke and laughed. After pulling out his phone, he snapped a short photo and added it to a message. "I located the child." Supaidaemon for the first time in a week, Izuku was at his desk a little while later. He had left it exactly as he had before being shot. In other words, anyone unfamiliar with Izuku Midoriya would assume it was littered with trash. He looked at a tiny set of speakers that had once been earphones and stated, "Well, given how I think her quirk works, something with a sound amplifying system would be ideal." Recalling that Kyoka had always worn a choker around her neck whenever he saw her, he scowled and said, "And since her quirk is her earlobes, maybe something like a choker would work?" As he worked, Eri sat on the bed and watched his hands rapidly assembling the piece of equipment as she snacked on a Nikoman that Inko had purchased for them to take home. "Daddy, what's that?" Izuku grinned and showed it to her, by now accustomed to being called Daddy. As the boy-turned-father laughed, the young girl cocked her head cutely and said, "This is my version of a miniature electrolarynx. Basically, if you can't speak, this little thing can give you your voice back. But this one is special." He put the device back on his desk and explained, "I've made it so that when Kyoka plugs her jacks into it, her voice, whether she screams, sings, or even just talks loud, comes out as a sonic attack to knock bad guys out." "So it's a present?" Eri blinked. With a little flush on his cheeks, Izuku said, laughing, "Yeah, it's a present." He grinned adoringly at the idea of the girl wearing one of his devices, saying, "She was so nice to us that I thought that I could do something nice for her." The girl gazed bewilderedly at her father image. "Do people do nice things for each other a lot?" Eri inquired. "No, not all the time," Izuku answered regretfully, shaking his head. "But some do, like me." Nodding, Eri said, "Daddy's really nice." "He certainly is, sweetie," Inko stated as she entered the room with the steamed buns and a plate of tea. As Izuku cleared a space on his desk to place the plate down, she grinned and said, "And I'm quite sure that he's famished after being completely out for a week. Though I have to say, Izuku, I wouldn't mind seeing more of Kyoka in the future." She laughed a little and added, "She's so sweet and she's been a joy to have around since I started taking care of Eri." Before reaching for one of the buns, he wiped some grease off his hands with a cloth. "Did she come around a lot?" Izuku said, a little surprised. While sitting on the edge of his bed beside Eri, his mother gave him a sly glance and said, "Quite a lot, as a matter of fact," grinning. "Since I still have my job, that week you were unconscious was hard on me because Eri didn't trust many people." Kyoka was gracious enough to offer to watch Eri while I was at work. Izuku bit into his bun and offered Eri another once she completed the one she was eating, thinking, that explains why they were at the hospital together yesterday. Eri whispered over her bun, "Miss Jiro is really nice, Daddy," as she ate. "She sang to me every day and read me stories." "Better be careful, sweetie, or she might start thinking Kyoka's her mommy," Inko murmured loudly, laughing as she looked at her son. If it weren't for Eri's disapproving expression, Izuku would have denied anything like that occurring. With a dejected tone, she declared, "Mommies are mean, and I don't want Miss Jiro to be my mommy." Eri nodded as the two Midoriyas echoed, "Mean?" Eri shocked the two of them by saying, "My mommy gave me to the bad people." After exchanging glances with his mother, Izuku got up and lifted the young girl. He gave his mother a somber look. "Eri, you know that your grandma is my mom, right?" she said, tilting her head. "She's never been mean to me. Not once. It's probably safe to say I've been kind of mean to her in the past." His mother gave him a sorrowful glance. "Has she been mean to you?" he asked, grinning at his mother before turning back to face the young child. "I said some things that made her sad, but she's never hurt me, ever." Eri's voice was so small that she said, "No, you see?" Izuku asked. "Not all mommies are bad. Some are just different than most, and some of them might seem mean to some people. I have a friend named Mitsuki, who is nice, but she is a bit loud, and she and her son fight a lot." Inko nodded. "He's right, dearie," she said as she got up and patted her back. "If you've ever heard them, then you'd think that they hated each other, but she loves him just as much as I love Izuku, and you, now, Eri. And nothing is going to change that." Eri seemed to accept it by nodding, then she finished her food and fell asleep. Izuku placed her on his bed and covered her with the covers. Then, as they walked out of the room, he turned to face his mother. Izuku shook her head and inquired, "Has she smiled at all since you've been looking after her?" "No, not once since I've been around her," she said with a watery scowl. Even Kyoka noticed. She thought she saw her beginning to smile once when she was singing to her, but that's as far as it got. She hasn't smiled at all. "Who could take the smile from the face of such a sweet little girl like her?" asked Izuku, shaking his head. Because she didn't want to know such an answer, Inko didn't respond. Fortunately, the doorbell rang at that same moment, and she hurried to answer it while Izuku simply returned to his work on the support item. She opened the door and greeted her guests, grinning as she peered through the peephole. "Kyoka, Mr. Yagi. What a nice surprise." Given the time of day, Kyoka was wearing her school uniform, perhaps because she had just left, and she was carrying a tiny box of chocolates and a small teddy bear. In addition to his typical outfit of a blue pinstripe business suit and cap, Yagi was carrying a briefcase at his left side. He smiled and raised his hat in her direction. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Midoriya," he said courteously. "I apologize for stopping by without warning, but we both decided to stop in after hearing that young Midoriya was being discharged today. I do hope we haven't come at a bad time?" he said. "Of course not," Inko responded, shaking her head. "Izuku and I have just put Eri to sleep, but you two are always welcome. Would either of you like some tea?" she asked, smiling at the two of them. "Sure," Kyoka said, smiling as she handed her the chocolates and the teddy. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought these for Eri. I thought that this might finally get a smile out of her," she said, her grin fading. The girl's act almost brought Inko to tears. As she accepted the gift, she grinned and said, "That's very considerate of you, dear. Thank you, I know she will love it." Toshinori simply laughed and said, "I haven't come empty-handed, either, Mrs. Midoriya," pointing to the briefcase he was holding. "The folks at the company just finished it this morning." He held up the case and said, "I've made sure that the suit is bullet and stab-proof, as well as fire-resistant." As Inko's eyes widened upon realizing that the case held the hero costume Yagi had promised for her son, he said, "The only thing that we couldn't do was insulated to prevent electrical damage on account of young Midoriya's bioelectrical powers." He then scowled at the woman and said, "And though I'm sorry to admit it, we did have to rearrange the color scheme to include less purple and more gray and black so that the connection wouldn't be too obvious." As she brought them into the living room, Inko nodded sympathetically and added, "That's very kind of you, Mr. Yagi." "Izuku, dear, Kyoka and Mr. Yagi are here to see you." She heard her son stutter and curse softly. "I'm sure that my baby will love it all the same." A second later, he staggered out of his room, one hand clutching the gift he had been working on for Kyoka, the other gripping a rag that was trying to remove any oil or grease stains from his hands and the device. "Back at it as soon as you got home, Toshinori asked, laughing as he observed the boy. Stumbling to think of something to say, Izuku gazed at the man and gave him a bashful nod instead. Then his gaze fell on Kyoka, and Inko smiled when she saw that both of them had a slight flush on their cheeks, her son more than Kyoka. I know that your mother has probably informed you of the situation with UA, and that you have been accepted thanks to my, meddling, I should say, Toshinori said, clearing his throat as he placed the case on the table and sitting down. Though, given how you were treated by its faculty, I would fully understand if you decided to receive your training elsewhere, he said, letting out a sigh as the boy nodded slowly and sitting across from the man. Izuku glanced at him and saw that he was discussing more than just getting turned down due to his previous quirkless status. When he begged All Might to become a quirkless hero, he was referring to personally rejecting him. Izuku, speaking for the first time since his arrival, said, I still want to go there, but it's not just because of that anymore. He spoke quickly, causing the adults to laugh. I want to go there because it's one of the hardest schools to graduate from. I heard an entire class was expelled the first day last year. When I was a kid, I wanted to go to the same school as All Might did, and that was UA. Oh my, exclaimed Inko. Hearing it made Kyoka's face go white. Seriously? She exclaimed incredulously. He nodded. The curriculum is, indeed, quite rigorous, and the teachers can be as harsh as villains at times, he stated with a grin, but I would dare say that you will have no trouble in graduating from such a school, because, as I've seen, you do not give up easily. Izuku said, I get that from my mom, and shook his head. He gets all of his best features from me, Inko said, sniffling as the tears began to fall, though my overly productive tear ducts isn't one of them. Inko felt tears of pride and excitement welling up in her eyes once more. Young Midoriya, he said, catching the boy's attention once more. Does this mean that you are willing to be accepted into UA? He asked, his voice tinged with sadness, even after you were treated so poorly because of your former status? Kyoka and Izuku laughed as she sobbed uncontrollably before Toshinori cleared his throat once more. I just have more to prove than others, Izuku replied, nodding with a resolute smile. But are you sure it's all right for me to be getting special treatment like this? Won't that cause some sort of favoritism issue? Izuku asked, his face taking on a worried expression. Toshinori sneered, special my behind, kid, he mumbled, and All Might wanted me to pass something along to you. And if it weren't for the prejudiced meddling of the faculty, you would have had more than enough rescue points to gain entrance to the school, he continued, his voice a little hot. Kyoka and his mother glanced at him, as did Izuku. With a sigh, Toshinori said, he told me of his little encounter with you. The two women gave him a somewhat shocked look, and both of us saw your performance in the practical exam, he said, frowning at the boy as his gaze strayed to his scarred hands. I've never seen anyone try as hard as you did that day, he said, as the boy's mother worried. Recovery girl said that your knuckles were broken, and your hands were fractured in several places, but you were still willing to risk your life to help those around you. He laughed as he shook his head, saying, and then this whole thing with little Eri, and your powers happened. When All Might heard about that, he said it was like someone had shattered his soul. Scorning someone that was more deserving of being a hero than even himself. He looked up to see the boy staring at him tearfully, saying, he told me that no amount of apologies, or favors could ever make up for the hypocrisy he committed. He shook his head and looked directly into the boy's eyes, saying, but, he added, All Might wanted to correct something he said. You can't be a hero without a quirk. Young Midoriya, All Might told me that you, young man, are already a far greater hero than he ever was or ever could be. He grinned as the boy's eyes began to well up with tears. As the youngster choked upon seeing the contents, Toshinori opened the suitcase and flipped it over, saying, and it is my pleasure, young man, to welcome you to the Hero Academia. And for that reason, he chose to honor yours and your mother's wish for your costume's design. Spiderman, in contrast to the chamber the terrible people had confined her in, Eri had been resting well in Izuku's room, feeling warm and comfortable in the All Might themed space. No one came to cut her, put needles in her arms, or take her to the bad man. The chamber was constantly bright. She only recognized the horribly sweet perfume of ether when it was directly in front of her nose, so she was entirely unprepared and surprised when she felt something being placed over her face. Just as someone clamped it over her face, her eyes sprung wide. A stern male voice murmured to her, don't struggle, kid, this'll all be over in a sec. Before the ether started to work, though, she struggled, kicking and thrashing her arms as much as she could. Her final gasp was followed by a scream that could be heard 2 floors below. The sound of a door being thrown down came from behind him, and the man must have understood what was about to happen because he dropped the little girl to the bed and ran for the open window before throwing himself through. However, something caught hold of his left leg as he cleared the window sill and was ready to fall from the window. Before he could look up at what had grabbed him, he yelled and fell, slamming into the building's brick wall. Before he was dragged back inside and hauled back up, all he noticed were someone's angry green eyes. Izuku's first clue that something was amiss was the piercing buzzing at the back of his skull. Then, from his room, where Eri was resting, came the frightened scream. The youngster was on his feet before he realized what he was doing, jumping for the door and using all of his increased strength to drive his shoulder into it. He fell in a crouch just in time to see Eri fall to the ground as someone tried to escape through his bedroom window. Izuku would never remember ever having moved so quickly as he did then, leaping forward, catching Eri in his right hand, and securely lifting her onto the bed while extending his left arm just long enough to grab the kidnapper's ankle. He pulled the victim back inside the flat, where he was flung into the waiting arms of a furiously angry Toshinori Yagi, feeling the bones crack with the pressure he applied as his fingers curled around the man's ankle. The man's piercing blue eyes sparkled with venom as the tall blonde raised him to eye level. He yelled into the man's face as he moaned in terror, "How dare you try taking this child from this home?" Given how effortlessly he started beating the abductor while the boy was wearing his web shooters, Izuku would readily concede that Toshinori Yagi was a powerful and terrifying man, even in his smaller size. Izuku webbed him there like a fly in a spider's web as Toshinori held him against the wall. Angry at the kidnapping attempt, Toshinori took out his phone to call Detective Tsukachi after the man was restrained. He gave Izuku's mother his cell phone so she could talk to the man while he used the landline. The principal said, "I'm well aware of the implications, but we can't leave this family at the mercy of these people. They need a safe house." He paused again before a look of annoyance appeared on his face. "Nezu, we have a problem," he said into the phone. "Eri was almost kidnapped right under our noses. If it weren't for young Midoriya, she very well may have been. I don't care how much red tape we have to go through." Izuku heard the gentle voice on the other end, which must have been the principal, as the skeletal blonde thundered, "Favoritism? Are you out of your mind? I'll pay for whatever is required so the school won't be out of pocket, but we need them in a protective environment. The school grounds are the best that we can offer with so many heroes standing by on campus. Now get it done," that he said. In the meantime, Inko was experiencing a similar issue. Yes, I understand, detective, but you must understand that, aside from my son, no one in the house has any combat-oriented quirks. God forbid she should have to, but I'm not even sure what Eri can do if she was forced to defend herself, his mother stated while on the phone. Then a furious expression appeared on her face. "That aside, I won't have my son branded as a vigilante." Inko yelled, "How dare you bring him up," loudly. As he knelt down beside Kyoka, who was caring for Eri, Izuku grimaced and said, "Must have mentioned Dad." With Eri curled up in her lap, still unconscious from the attempt, Kyoka turned to face him and said, "Your dad's a vigilante?" She also noticed that her small horn had grown considerably. "Yeah, I used to think it was cool until a few years ago," the boy replied with a slight grimace. He turned to thieving. As Kyoka whispered, "Geez, I'm sorry to hear that," she asked, how bad is he?" Before responding, he inhaled deeply to regain his composure. "Ever heard of the Prowler?" Izuku inquired. "Holy crap, your dad is the Prowler." Kyoka's eyes widened like saucers. As the child hung his head, she hissed, "Hey, that's nothing to be ashamed of," she whispered reassuringly. "A lot of people think he's awesome." With his head resting in his hands, Izuku sighed and said, "He doesn't even call anymore," gesturing to himself, "but I can guess why. It's pretty embarrassing to have a quirkless kid these days." Izuku shrugged. "I used to think so, too, but it's been so long since I've seen him that I wouldn't even know what he looked like now." "Hey, come on, there's no proof of that," the girl said, holding Eri's head against her chest. "Besides, if that were the case, he could have been like a lot of other people, and put you up for adoption instead of just leaving you alone with your mom." She frowned and added, "And even then he could have tried to have another kid." Izuku had to concur with her. "Oh, that's right," he said, taking the gadget he had been working on earlier out of his pocket. I made this for you." Kyoka's cheeks flushed slightly as Izuku pulled the small black necklace out of his pocket. She rarely received gifts from boys, and Izuku appeared to be holding something pricey. She accepted the choker with a smile and a little laugh, saying, "You didn't have to get me anything, you know?" She was grateful for the present. "But I didn't spend anything," Izuku remarked, scowling slightly. "I actually built this." Her expression was one of surprise. "But this looks like a really expensive piece of jewelry," she asked. "You built?" Is this support gear? Izuku asked shyly as she accepted the choker and noticed the small plug ports for her quirk. The kid nodded timidly. Yeah, since I guessed that your quirk uses sound as a weapon, I thought maybe you could use something like this, he started explaining. When you plug your jacks into it, it amplifies your voice to supersonic levels. This is so cool, Kyoka said, smiling at him. I've submitted some ideas to have speakers in my boots so that I can use my own heartbeat for the sound, but I never thought to use my voice. Kyoka moved slightly to avoid waking Eri, and removed the choker she was wearing to replace it with the support item. That made Izuku smile. You've got such a pretty voice, though, he remarked, before realizing what he had said. The girl turned scarlet at the comment. I mean that, Eri likes to hear you sing, he blurted out quickly. Kyoka began to absently wrap her left ear jack around her pointer finger, still flushed. Oh, she does she? She asked. Well, I like singing for her, too. Aggravating rodent, Toshinori muttered abruptly as he hung up the phone, and Inko returned his cell phone. How'd it go on your end? He asked. Tsukachi is coming over with a few others to pick up the kidnapper, she said. He's also prepared to post guards around our apartment building to make sure there are no more attempts on Eri, but I don't know if that's good enough. The skeletal man nodded. I agree. He sighed and turned to face the woman, saying, I know you don't want to risk him, but what about your husband? He was glaring at the man who was still affixed to the wall and was glaring at the family. Fortunately, his mouth was webbed shut, or else he would have been yelling like a sailor. What about him? She said defensively, her face darkening considerably. Now, I'm not trying to imply anything, the blonde man replied in defense, raising his hands. I'm just suggesting that you could get in touch with him and let him know what's going on. True, he would help if he knew that he was needed, Inko said with a deep sigh, observing her gaze stray toward her son. But seeing him could, she trailed off anxiously. You know I've met the man before? Toshinori asked, startling her. I asked him why he was a vigilante, he said, frowning. His answer was similar to what Izuku went through with Yue. He explained, and the woman grinned. His quirk was deemed too weak to be a hero, even though he displayed great potential. When he said this, his eyes softened knowingly. The woman sighed quietly and shook her head, saying, I already know all of that, pointing to the couch where the kids were chatting. I'm worried about him and Izuku. Hisashi's absence left its mark on our son. Do you believe he feels ashamed of the boy? Asked Toshinori with a smile. I certainly don't, though I know my husband does have other reasons for staying away from us, Inko replied regretfully, shaking her head slowly. But Izuku believes that his father turning to thievery was because he was quirkless at the time, she added. But I know Hisashi still loves us. If you decide to contact him, Toshinori said with a smile, let him know that the charges against him were dropped, and Inko's eyes widened. And tell him that if he decides to come back, I'll pull some strings with Yue and have him hired as a groundskeeper to guard the school. Inko said, you can do that. He nodded. Technically, he's working as a mercenary, and as I said, the charges against him have been dropped, he just doesn't know it, yet, he said. Nowadays, I hear he does under-the-table hero work, and some bounty hunting for the pro-hero companies. That's true, but, Inko said, nodding, before turning back to face her son. She was no longer sure what was right for him because he had already experienced so much. However, she had never inquired as to why Hisashi had ceased contacting her. Think it over as much as you like, Mrs. Midoriya, Toshinori remarked, reaching over and patting her shoulder. He then went to the kids and said, Young Midoriya, now might be a good time to try your new costume on, telling the boy that he might need the protection it provides before the night was done. Spiderman Tsukachi led the charge when the cops arrived less than 20 minutes later. The Midoriya family was prepared to be removed from their house and placed in protective custody, while the would-be kidnapper was removed from the wall and sent to the precinct for questioning. A figure appeared from the corner of the building as the police escorted Kyoka and the small family into Toshinori's car. Damn it, the man said, scowling and taking out a phone. Mr. Rappa. Bad news. My guy failed, he said, adding, from what I've heard, the kid and the family taking care of her are heading for the UA school, and they've got a full police escort. Rappa remarked, he. Sounds like I get to have some fun, adding, the kid's still the priority, right? Yup. Boss says roughing her up a little's fine, but don't kill her, alright? The man nodded, reminding him. Rappa said, no worries, in an enthusiastic manner. You'll take care of your guy, right? Too bad. I kind of feel sorry for these poor folks, the kidnapper's companion muttered as he disconnected up. We'll take care of everything on our end. Spiderman, after finishing her conversation with her parents, Kyoka put her phone in the pocket of her jacket. My mom and dad are gonna meet us at the school, she told the Midoriya family, with Izuku on high alert and Inko giving the girl a troubled look. As promised, Toshinori had created Izuku's costume out of premium materials that were impenetrable by bullets and stabs and gave the impression that the wearer was a serious person. Even though the situation was severe, the boy's serious expression was giving her goosebumps, so she thought, the clothes really do make the hero, as her cheeks began to heat up a bit. She also made an effort to ignore the way the suit appeared to shape itself around him, highlighting his muscles. As she held Eri on her lap, the anxious mother moaned, "But I want my family safe as soon as possible. I'm going to have to apologize to them for putting you all through so much trouble," Inko remarked. "No, don't worry, Mrs. M." Kyoka waved it aside, looking out the window. "My dad would have done the same thing," she comforted the woman, knowing that her dad would have been much more alarmed than Inko had been when everything went wrong. Toshinori questioned from the front, "Young Midoriya, can you tell if there's anyone tailing us?" "No, and that's what has me worried." Izuku simply shook his head. He explained that his spider sense, as he was starting to refer to it, had been lightly buzzing at the back of his mind ever since they had left the apartment, but not sufficiently so that he believed they were in imminent danger. Only that they were somehow being watched. With the same nagging feeling that they were stumbling into a trap, Toshinori nodded in accord. "Daddy? Are the bad people gonna get us?" Eri asked, turning to face the hero in training dressed in green, purple, and black. "No," she heard 4 voices say at once, "and even if they did, you know I would come get you right away, don't you?" Izuku said, taking the young girl from his mother and holding her to his chest. "No one is going to take you from us, Eri, I promise you that," he said, being cautious of the sharp claws on the fingertips of his gloves. The young girl looked up at him fearfully and whispered, Please don't," adding, If it's really them, then they'll." Eri nodded her head before reaching around and giving him the tightest hug her tiny arms could contain. Izuku reached up and tapped her on the tip of her horn, saying, "Eri, you're my daughter, which means you're a part of my family, now." He also said to the young girl, "And nothing in this world would keep me away from you if you were ever in trouble. Understand?" Gently returning the embrace, he replied, "That's my girl." Then he reached for his belt and took out a tiny disc-shaped gadget the size of an American penny. "And just to make sure that I can always find you, no matter where you are, I'll give you this." He added as he placed it in her tiny fingers, "Hold it tight, don't let anyone take it from you, and I'll always be able to find you, no matter what." Eri put the tracer in her hair like a barrette after nodding. A child's hair adornment would go unnoticed. Then, holding the small teddy bear Kyoka had given for her, she sat between Izuku and Inko. Kyoka had already handed Inko some chocolates, but they were in her purse for later. Kyoka was thrilled to see the girl's eyes light up when she tasted the chocolates. When Kyoka saw the girl's happy expression, she thought, everyone loves chocolate, but no smile yet. However, Kyoka could almost see the tiniest trace of a smile spreading over the tiny girl's face as she now nestled between her new family. She longed, briefly, that she could be a part of the little girl's life, thinking to herself, this is probably the first time she's felt any sort of affection. Envy was rising in her bosom. Suddenly, she had a fleeting vision of herself seated next to Eri, squeezed between Izuku and herself. "Hold the phone, whoa, whoa, whoa. I can't be drawn to him." She shook her head. "I hardly know him, who am I to want to be this child's mother?" The boy was grasping at the back of his head and staring straight up when she turned back to face the small family, or more precisely, Izuku. Rather than consoling Eri or checking out the window to make sure nobody was approaching. She held her breath in her throat as Izuku's eyes widened. Izuku's spider sense appeared to momentarily stop time, as if in precognition, enabling him to see what was about to happen as a huge figure fell on the automobile, crushing Toshinori in the process. Izuku shouted, "Incoming from above in 10 seconds, and flung himself over Eri and his mother. As the girls and his mother yelled, Toshinori unquestionably slammed on the brakes and made a sharp left turn, fishtailing the car around and into the road's side railings, the left side of the vehicle just touching against them. Izuku was focused at something else, but the police escort also applied the brakes. A second later, a huge figure slammed into the road, sending a vibration through the car, and Kyoka discovered exactly what had disturbed the child up. Whoever this man was, he was nearly as large as All Might. In addition, the man donned what appeared to be a plague mask and metal gauntlets on his arms. All the 2 teenagers needed to know was that Eri was whimpering at the sight of the mask. Toshinori exclaimed, "Is everyone all right?" as the villain suddenly accelerated at the car. In his big hands, he dug into the frame of the passenger door where Izuku sat. The door crumpled as the boy, wearing his mask, pulled what appeared to be a round grenade with his thumb on a primer. The behemoth gazed down at them as Izuku threw his weapon, and suddenly the door was torn away. The man yelled, "Give me that girl, and no one gets, hey," as the grenade burst all over him, becoming a mess of web-like substance. "Why, you little son of a bit." Izuku shot a glob of webbing directly at his mouth, snarling, "Language," and making him drop the door. As he leapt from the wrecked car, he said, "And if you think you're taking Eri, then you've got another thing coming." With a shout, "Izuku, wait!" Inko dragged Eri away from the door. She was aware that Izuku would not sit around doing nothing, even when the villain was tearing himself free with ease. Izuku yelled, "What are you doing?" as Toshinori leapt out and grabbed the boy's shoulder before he could take any action. "Making sure that you don't ruin your chances at UA," the individual replied. "I, Toshinori Yagi, personal assistant to All Might for Might Towers, give you, Izuku Midoriya, permission to engage this villain." As the man let him go, a look of understanding appeared on his face. Izuku knelt down as a shock of electricity rushed through his legs. Izuku hurled himself toward the man with explosive force, leaving behind green arcs of electricity, just as the villain tore the webs from his body. Even Toshinori was surprised when the youngster jumped and created a shockwave that caused the automobile to briefly bounce off the ground. As the cops scurried out of their cars with their weapons drawn, the man said, "All right, everyone out. He can't focus on the fight if he's worried about protecting us in this busted heap." As he did so, he barked out. Before Izuku could deliver a deadly blow to the villain, Kyoka was the first to step in and save the day. This time, there were no electrical sparks, but the impact was just as powerful, and the man was sent back, having to dig his feet into the tarmac to stay upright. "Kyoka!" Inko yelled behind her as the woman, Eri still tightly gripped in her arms, struggled to exit the vehicle. The girl quickly came to her aid, supporting Inko with her right arm while holding Eri in her left. "That's Kendo Rappa. He's classed as a B-rank villain." Toshinori flagged down one of the cops before yelling at Izuku, "Young Midoriya, be on the lookout for his quirk. It's focused on his shoulders." As the cops began to encircle the battling pair, the youngster ignored the guy and continued to stare at the villain, who began to rotate his shoulders. He shouted to the detective, "Tsukachi, tell your men to hold their fire," before returning his focus to the battle. "Don't panic," he said, "all of his power is in forward strength, but he can't keep it up for long. Keep your distance, and tire him out." As the villain started to laugh and get closer to Izuku, he remained extremely composed rather than terrified. He rattled off in his mind, "Kendo Rappa, a B-rank villain from underground fighting rings, known for his brutality and bloodlust. His quirk is registered as Strongarm, which allows him to rotate his shoulders at extreme speeds, allowing him to smash his opponents with almost endless punches, but it's said that he can't keep it going for more than a few seconds, so." As he lumbered forward, wiping a little blood from his lips, Rappa muttered, Kid, I'll admit that you got a lot of spunk," and the villain smiled at the lad. "But you ain't got nothing on my boss. Give me a little time, and I'll lay him out right next to you after I'm done," Izuku stated, maintaining his low stance. "You might be bigger than me, but I promise that I won't go down easy," the boy added. "Now that's what I like to hear." Rappa simply smiled and raised his fists before roaring and lunging for the youngster, his fist cocked back for a forceful strike. "Better give me a good fight after that line, kid." "My name is Spiderman," Izuku said, launching a double line of webs onto the wrecked vehicle door before swinging it overhead and around to smash it down on Rappa, who snorted and threw a flurry of punches at it. When he did, Izuku pulled back and flung himself forward into a leaping kick, firing another round of webs at his bare midriff. He barely rolled out of danger before the kick brushed the villain's exposed left side because his spider sense alerted him before Rappa could strike him with a fist. "Not bad, Spider, I actually felt that," Rappa said, laughing uncontrollably as he felt his ribs shatter. He then reached down, grabbed the offending leg, and pulled the child around, slamming him onto the tarmac. But not good enough. As the concrete brushed against the metal plates of his suit, the child let out a moan. Spider-Man put something on his chest and said, "Then how about this?" Rappa glanced down at the gadget, which was blinking just before it launched a strong electrical bolt into the villain's chest. As the onslaught stopped, Rappa yelled, "Arg!" as the electricity arced over him. "You little brat." He threw his fist back, but Izuku was already leaping aside and hurling another web bomb at the villain. The bomb sprayed all over the pavement, but he slapped it aside before it could explode. "That one won't work on me again, kid," he growled. "You know, I was just gonna grab the kid and go, but you're making this fun. Let's see how much you can take." As Rappa's explosive speed brought him after him, his fists flying. His spider sense went haywire. I'm history if I take one blow from those. As he barely escaped a strike that crushed the street, he thought hurriedly, the one thing I can count on is that he can't use it eternally. I just need to stay out of range till he stops. He webbed himself into the air and backflipped away. I just need a single shot. He had briefly considered swinging himself around with the web shooter, but when he swung awkwardly into a building's side, he wished he had followed through. He swatted the boy off the side of the building and sent him crashing down onto the streets below, saying, "A fancy way to turn tail and run." Rappa was already jumping into the air after him, asking, "Is that all you've got?" The villain landed and stalked toward the boy as he stumbled to his feet, saying, "Guess I was wrong about you, Lil Spider." Before jumping out of the path, Izuku shook his head and replied, "Nah, just wanted to give the police a fair chance." "Huh?" Rappa asked, looking at the lad bewildered as he threw himself against a building's side. It seemed that he had completely forgotten about the police officers surrounding him. "You heard him, men, open fire," shouted Tsukachi. "You think that's enough to stop me?" he exclaimed as he dashed to the edge of the street, grabbed a light post, wrenched it out of the ground, and threw it at the police officers, forcing them to duck for cover as bullets rang out in the streets and pelted the big villain. "My quirk might be in my shoulders, but my muscles are harder than tempered steel." As Izuku sprang off the building he was attached to re-engage, Kyoka started to get concerned. "Toshinori," she said to the man, "let me fight." Startled at her request, Toshinori turned to face her and said, "Come again?" "You heard me," she exclaimed as she snapped the choker on and plugged her jacks into the gadget, the skin of her neck quivering a little before the device settled. The girl was reaching into her blazer and taking out Izuku's gift to her. Rappa punched the boy hard, crushing him into the concrete as Toshinori took in a breath between his teeth. All right, go." Kyoka pivoted and hurried into the altercation. The villain had his left arm in an iron hold while Izuku was hanging limp from Rappa's grasp. "Not so tough now, are ya, spider brat?" the gigantic guy mocked. She sucked in a breath as she heard him choking, then swore as loudly and as long as she could. She wasn't prepared for the scream that emerged from her mouth. The high-pitched keen echoed in front of her, breaking windows and tearing up asphalt and concrete. Rappa was sent to his knees and into a painful rage as he dropped the boy to shield his ears. Izuku was barely able to control himself from the sonic assault, but he needed to take action against Rappa before Kyoka was compelled to halt. "The vitality I sensed in my legs?" He started pushing it into his arms, more especially his right fist, and up through his torso. Now it was blazing with green electricity. Rappa was flung away from him, crashing into and through a building across the street, as he leapt at the villain and slammed the supercharged fist directly into his face, sending a shockwave of electrical energy flying. As the lad struck his knees, Kyoka halted her scream and hurried to his side. "Izuku," she skidded to a stop and fell to her knees. "I'm so sorry," she cried half-heartedly as she held his head in her lap. "I couldn't think of a better way to get a shot at him," she yelled as the teenager slowly reached up and removed his mask. A tiny bit of blood was trickling from his mouth, nose, and ears, and Kyoka whimpered. "Oh my God." Izuku grabbed her by the wrist and said, I can't hear you right now," panting wearily as he looked up at her. "But thanks. Kyoka. You saved my life." His smile was one of admiration. As the police and his family gathered around them, Kyoka let out a cry of relief and clung to him, her arms embracing him tightly. Tsukachi could hear Toshinori talking loudly to someone about setting up the nurse's office as she was yelling commands to detain the villain. Subaidamon a few hours later, Tokyo's Might Towers in Minato. Any pro-hero, including those at the Might Towers agency, had to deal with paperwork, and Toshinori was now drowning in his own misery. A complete incident report in triplicate was requested by the Shizuoka area's primary police office. The UA he had to fill out an employment contract for a known vigilante, mercenary, and the faculty was going to have a field day with him for letting 2 unlicensed teenagers use their quirks and dangerous items of support gear. They were considering the remote mine Izuku used as dangerous. The man reclined back with a contented smile on his thin face and sighed, "That being said, it's going to be worth it." Following the combat, Izuku and Kyoka received praise from the police for a job well done, while Rappa was removed as quickly as Tsukachi could arrange a transport to Tartarus. Although he had not identified himself as All Might, Toshinori Yagi, who was a member of a reputable hero agency, believed that he had made the proper decision in allowing the 2 youngsters to pose as pros because there were no pros available. Izuku's hearing improved under the nurse's care after they arrived at the school and were escorted to her office for Recovery Girl to treat both kids. Kyoka couldn't contain her admiration for the sonic choker he had created once he could hear her. Therefore, until they finally arrived at UA, the girl continued to express her gratitude to Izuku for his present. Eri and his mother were hugging the poor child's stuffing while Izuku was blushing uncontrollably. If Toshinori hadn't been so upset with himself for not partaking in the battle rather than leaving it all to the kids, he would have found the entire situation humorous. Eri was afraid that her father would be killed by Rappa, and Inko had been inconsolable the whole time until Izuku had knocked the villain unconscious. However, he had once again shown everyone to be mistaken. And he used a skill that no one really knew he had, Toshinori said, laughing to himself as he signed another form to be sent out. Come to think of it, we don't really know just how strong young Midoriya actually is, yet. He laughed once more, saying, this is going to be an excellent year. Maybe I won't see the rise of a new symbol of peace, but two of them? Since someone, whom neither Detective Tsukachi nor Toshinori understood how or who it was, had obtained video of the villain confronting a purportedly new hero, Rappa's assault on the Midoriya family's police escort had created quite a stir in the media community. The morning paper's headlines said, a startling debut, the B-rank villain is stopped by an arachnid hero. The wanted criminal Kendo, the rapper, Rappa attacked and attempted to kidnap an unnamed family during a police escort last night, but it appears that a new hero was also present during the escort. Despite the brutality of the battle, the hero, who referred to himself as Spiderman, was ultimately able to defeat the murderous villain, enabling the police to apprehend the dangerous villain. She saves my life, and all the media can talk about is how I took this guy down, Izuku thought as he picked up another paper, noting that one article did use her little assault on the villain. The media was having a blast of success with Izuku and Kyoka's debuts, but the article made no mention of Kyoka's involvement in the attack, much to his annoyance. Adolescent beauty helps new pro. A young girl with a quirk that enabled her to use her voice in the form of a sonic attack helped a new hero during a dangerous villain attack late last night. While the hero was on the ropes, the villain displayed incredible bravery by leaping into action and stunning the villain with a scream that caused a great deal of damage to the surrounding area, and disoriented the villain long enough for the hero to bring him down for good. The story featured a full-length photo of Kyoka hugging him after the battle was over, which made Izuku smile and even blush. Luckily for him, the camera did not capture his face. Naturally, those were only the positive reviews they received. The negative ones came from the Japanese edition of the Daily Bugle, one of which featured a full-color picture of Izuku wearing his spider suit with a picture of the Prowler next to it, highlighting the similarities between his and his father's costumes. New hero confronts renowned vigilante. Even though heroes are now licensed heroes in all shapes, sizes, and colors, it appears that our most recent hero has chosen a very dubious mentor based on his costume. Yes, we are referring to the notorious thief, the Prowler. He has been a threat to the heroic society for the past 11 years and shows no signs of abating his one-man act of violence, vandalism, and general menacing of society as a whole. I wonder if Dad's seen any of this. Izuku sighed and placed the paper down on his new desk. The safe house that UA had set up for them was actually a 2-story townhouse. Imagine a 2-story version of the dorms that was more than big enough to house a family of 10. He asked himself as he surveyed his roomy new bedroom. It seems that Toshinori Yagi, also known as All Might, carried a lot of weight behind him, even in his civilian form. Additionally, they had been provided with a variety of furniture, a fully furnished and stocked kitchen, thanks to Lunch Rush, as well as ample sleeping and storage spaces. Needless to say, his mother had never felt more pampered. Naturally, her job had been terminated for her own safety once they were under UA's protection, meaning she now only had her husband's money to rely on. In order to ensure that Eri's room was directly between them in case the young girl became frightened and wanted to climb into bed with one of them at any point, the small family had taken rooms on the second floor. Still scared after the meeting with Rappa, she had spent the previous night sleeping with Izuku. Kyoka and her family were also asked to remain, given the late hour of their arrival following the turmoil produced by the villain. After hearing what had happened, Kyoka's father, Kyotoku, became enraged with the police and demanded to know why no pro-heroes had been present to help with the escort. Izuku had also wondered why, and Toshinori had explained drearily that none of the local pros had been available to help because of the suddenness of the situation. Even Toshinori was finding it hard to believe that the cops hadn't called in a few pros to help, and Kyotoku wasn't the only one who thought the explanation was a bunch of bullshit. Naomasa had reiterated, emphasizing that none were available. Both families were disgusted when Toshinori translated that as, neither of them thought the escort was important enough. UA had a lot of professionals working for them, yet none of them had gone on the scene to assist. Since he was aware that the professionals working at UA were among the best in the business, Izuku sought to protect them by arguing that there was too much distance between them and the school at the time. There were still a few months until UA's first-year classes started, and he had been excused from school rather easily, so he sat back with a sigh and smiled, realizing that part of his hero fantasies was finally coming true. Because he was as much of a geneticist as the majority of people who disdained individuals who were identified as quirkless, the principal of his previous school had readily granted him a pass and permitted him to graduate. Izuku suspected that the man saw the youngster as a stain on his records, so he let him go with ease because he was unaware that Izuku was no longer diagnosed as such. After everything was finished, though, Toshinori opened an investigation into Alderaan Middle School on the grounds that the faculty was allegedly teaching the pupils Meta-Liberation Army doctrine. Izuku could not deny that the man was merciless, and that made him smile. All Might was working very hard to make the lad feel better about what he had done to him, and it was paying off. Turning away from his desk, Izuku gazed at his new hero costume. As he took in the purple, green, and black costume, he thought, I can't believe he used the design I had in mind. I wonder if they'll let me into the support course room to fix them? The boy looked down at the gadgets he had basically made from the garbage he had managed to scrounge up from Dagobah Beach, and sighed. They were bulky, and while they worked, they looked awful next to his suit. His father's suit was less streamlined and had more purple on it, but he couldn't find anything wrong with it. In light of that, he picked up his notebook containing all of his designs and went downstairs. Did Kyoka and her family already leave? He asked, kissing Eri's forehead and his mother's face as he came down the stairs to the kitchen, where Eri was seated at the table eating a platter of apple slices. Not noticing their house guests, he inquired. The boy sat down and started eating, but his mother shook her head and said, No, they just haven't gotten up yet. We're actually up quite early, dear, she said, pointing to the wall clock that read just past 6. And Mika said that little Kyoka is not a morning person, so I figured that, with all of the nonsense that happened last night, I'd let them sleep a little while, she said. It wasn't often that young heroes fought a powerful villain, so Izuku nodded, fully understanding. Did the cops discover anything about Rappa? So he's not talking? He inquired while eating, but his mother simply shook her head. With her son staring at her inquisitively, Inko sighed and stated, Dear, I know that this isn't something you'll want to hear, adding, Rappa escaped while he was on his way to Tartarus this morning. Only a few hours ago. Choking, Izuku exclaimed, Wahk what? She looked more closely at the youngster and said, Izuku, I know that you want to be a hero, but last night scared me out of more than a few years of my life. Inko nodded and said, It hasn't been publicized yet, but apparently he was broken out of confinement while en route to the facility. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I don't know if I could take it if that monster came after us again. Seeing you fight with that monster was worse than watching you get bullied by Bakugo. As he reached for an empty glass and an orange juice pitcher on the table, Izuku grinned and shook his head. Mom, I get it, he said. I got lucky last night. As he filled his glass, he glanced at young Eri and remarked, I don't know if I'd be here right now if it weren't for Kyoka. But I have obligations now. Eri's safety, and becoming a hero that can protect her. Inko smiled sadly, I know that, baby, but hearing about it on the news and actually seeing it are two different things. She continued, and the way you fought, while I think you did well, but your father would have called it sloppy. I understand, Izuku said, pausing with the glass partially up to his lips before nodding. He finished his lunch and drank the juice, saying, I need to be better. He got up and rinsed his plate at the sink before saying, I'm going to the school to look at the support course room. They might be able to assist me with upgrading some of my technology. Eri brightened, May I also attend? Not wishing to be parted from the boy, she inquired. Izuku looked at his mother and said, Will you be all right, or should I? He grinned at her and added, You sure can, Eri, as she leapt out of her chair and ran straight up to him, jumping into his arms. Go, she said with a smile to the two of them. She would benefit from some fresh air and a walk without the fear of kidnapping. Izuku nodded, tucked his notepad under one arm, and pulled Eri up onto his shoulders before stepping away from her. Remember your costume, dear. After hearing the door close, Inko sighed and took out her phone, grinning a little at the number of missed calls from hubby. She then made the decision to call back. Before it was picked up, the phone rang just once. Inko? Hello, dear, Inko greeted them. I assume you've seen the newspaper from this morning? I did, and I have to ask. What the hell, Inko? A heavy sigh came from the other end. Izuku has a quirk now? He inquired. What time did that occur? It's a bit of a story, Inko groaned, and then she told her husband what had happened before the news stories. Dear God in heaven, the man moaned, and she could clearly hear him scratching his brow. Inko, I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this alone. It's not like you're free to walk around these days, Hisashi, Inko stated with a smile, adding, besides, he has your tenacity. Over the phone, Hisashi Midoriya grumbled, what does Inko think of me? Why must he believe that? There was a time when I thought that you were doing what you're doing to make him proud of you, Inko murmured, drawing a big breath of her own, and then the theft happened, and I don't know what to think. Inko swallowed and bit her lip. The theft wasn't my doing, honey, she said. I was set up to take the fall for a client's mistake, but I won't blame you for not believing me. Inko replied, and there was a long period that I thought you were ashamed of Izuku being quirkless. Inko Midoriya, there has never been a moment in my life that I have ever been ashamed of our son. He said in the softest tone she had ever heard him use, I may not have been around, but I've kept tabs on him. The line was silent for a long time as she heard his breathing stop entirely. I am aware of his diligence and commitment to his academics. During the practical exam at UA, I even broke into the security cameras. And I couldn't recall ever being more proud of him in my life from the day he was born than when I seen him working so hard that his fists were bleeding. With her tears streaming freely, Inko was in full blubber mode and hardly managed to contain herself. Do you truly mean that? I do, he replied, and the only reason I haven't been home is because I'm accused of stealing. He added, that's what I'm ashamed of, darling. That I got played so easily. Vigilantism aside, that was a tremendous black mark on my career. Dear. The charges were dropped a long time ago, Inko said with a smile into the phone. They come home, Inko begged, because there is a man here who would like to hire you to be a campus guard for UA. Please, Hisashi, she continued, you can see your son and do honest, low-risk work. I need you, and we need you. After a lengthy pause during which her husband appeared to consider the situation, Hisashi stated, you tell this guy, whoever he is, that I'll take the job, adding, I'll be there in a few hours. Oh, we're not at the apartment anymore, Inko scowled and informed him, we had to leave after. Don't worry, he continued, I know, sweetheart, I'll locate you. Inko's heart began to fill with joy as the line died. Perhaps things aren't as horrible as I think. Spiderman Eri said, perched on Izuku's shoulders as he strolled through the UA hallways, this house is really big. Izuku laughed. Trust me, Eri, there are places that are much bigger than this one as far as houses go, he continued. But this isn't a house, it's a school. Blinking, Eri said, school? Perhaps when you're ready, we can send you to school so you can meet some people. It's where people come to learn things, he said to her. Eri was perplexed once more. What is a buddy, Daddy? A friend is. He attempted to think for a moment as his thoughts drifted to pictures of Kyoka and Katsuki, who had been inseparable when they were little, before he had acquired his quirk. However, everything changed as the ashen blonde's quirk appeared. Kyoka, on the other hand, was different. Izuku believed she could be a true friend. You know Kyoka? Eri nodded her head, saying, she's a friend. Someone you can rely on, chat to, and play with. Is she a buddy of mine? Eri inquired. That's right. Izuku gave a nod. Eri was silent for a minute, perhaps considering, but then she suddenly said, so she's not my mommy? Izuku held the young child on his shoulders, so he froze completely, trying to stay erect. And no, not at all. The idea of Kyoka playing Eri's mother made Izuku twitch a little, but it wasn't a particularly bad one. As he began to move again, he thought, calm down, Izuku, you hardly know the girl, after all, she did visit me daily in the hospital with Eri, so she, no, do not go there, besides, what kind of girl would show interest in a quirkless? Right, I'm not quirkless anymore, but. Innocently, Eri said, Daddy, you're talking a lot again. Please, God, just murder me now. He was able to keep this to himself. Izuku tried to maintain some dignity during the rest of the somber walk to the support course room, while Eri simply marveled at some of the classrooms they passed, some of which had doors so enormous that Izuku assumed they must have been designed for students with gigantification quirks. Suddenly, Izuku's spider sense went crazy. He watched the door slowly being thrown off its hinges and banging against the opposite wall, and his vision briefly became blurry as he saw what was happening a few feet down the corridor. Just as the 2-foot-thick steel doors were suddenly thrown out of their frame and into the opposing wall by a great explosion that shook the entire hallway, Izuku instinctively leapt back. and Eri fell over his head and into his arms as he leapt and latched himself to the ceiling. Ow, 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 man, I didn't think the opposing forces would be that strong, someone said as they stumbled out of the room. The voice of a girl, hoarse from the smoke, said. And that's the reason I urged you to wait until I looked at the calibrations before doing anything. Really, Hatsume, if you're going to make a gravity boot, you need to consider how much force the propelling side is going to produce, said a different voice, this one more frustrated than angry, as though this were a common occurrence. Yes, but wouldn't rocket boots be preferable? Hatsume, the girl, said once more. Ack, you two weren't caught in that, were you? Powerloader said, turning to face the two clinging to the ceiling, after emerging from the smoke to reveal a man armored like a bulldozer. You haven't even started your real classes, yet, and you've already been labeled a living disaster. There's absolutely no way I'm letting you anywhere near rocket fuel until 3rd year, and that's only if you last that long. After making sure Eri was okay, Izuku shook his head and leapt down, but she looked up at him and asked, can we do that again? With a straight face, Eri asked. Note to self. Take Eri for a swinging ride after I get the hang of it. The boy laughed, and he thought, we're fine. Izuku smiled and said, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Powerloader. He tried not to nerd out in front of Eri because he felt that it was already bad enough that he muttered in front of her without adding fuel to the fire. I watched you during the practical, the man said, smiling behind his mask. You must be that kid that old Toshinori was harping to Nezu about, he said. Gotta say, I'm impressed that he caved in so easily. As the smoke cleared, a girl with pink hair and goggles over crosshair-like pupils was revealed. You're a difficult young man. Eri said, Daddy's really strong. Izuku flushed. Powerloader turned to face Izuku after glancing at the young girl. Aren't you too young to be a father? And what about her mother? He inquired. Eri stated, I don't have a mommy. The girl with the pink hair's eyes widened. Whoa. Keep your eyes off of me. Hatsume shook her head quickly and waved her hands, saying, I make my own babies. It's a recent thing, Izuku began with a laugh, before grabbing his notes. But I was wondering if you might help me enhance some of the tech I've been using? Hatsume seemed to teleport for a moment, saying, did you say improve? She shouted, grabbing the book, let's see, let's see. Eri sank into his shoulder and remarked, she yells a lot, she acts like my old mommy. Powerloader took notice of that and was able to persuade the girl to back off a little. I'll be the judge on whether or not you work on it, Hatsume, he told her, before taking the boy's notes to look at them himself. These are some detailed designs, he said with a faint impressionistic tone. I don't know what you're going to stuff these web shooters with, so they're going to be a little tricky. Oh, you've also put down the formula. Good. The same formula for the web bombs, except they have a larger payload and an explosive to trigger the release of the web fluid, said Hatsume, who was now excitedly peering over his shoulder. If you don't mind, I might use some kind of electronic trigger in its place. Presenting one of his first web shooters, Izuku shook his head and stated, I don't. When I started making these things, all I really had to work with was garbage from Dagoba Beach. Then I'm doubly impressed that you made such a fine support item from such low-grade materials, Powerloader said before turning the page. Spider tracer, remote mine and a spider drone. These are some pretty impressive tech ideas for someone that's not even going for the support course. I'm actually jealous of the hero course right now. It's how I was going to fight before I got my quirk, but since I have most of the abilities of a spider, I thought my gadgets would be a good gimmick. Spider-like powers and spider-themed gadgets, Hatsume added, they're creepy, but I enjoy it. Izuku thought he had just been stabbed in the back. Spooky? As Powerloader slapped the female, his face dropped. Hard. What did I do? Moaned Hatsume. I've already got the specs on your costume, so I'll make the items to match, the pro hero remarked, clearing his throat. I'll try to make the wrist-mounted web shooters a bit less bulky so you can use them better, he added. Additionally, I want to attempt strengthening these web cartridges a little bit so they can hold more. Is that acceptable? Please, feel free to make any improvements you think will be necessary, Izuku said, handing him the case containing his costume. Also, could I get your autograph? Izuku requested hesitantly. He took out one of his numerous notebooks. Always the fanboy. Subaidaemon, will we really allow this child to enroll here? Class 1A instructor Shota Aizawa was asked. This class was expelled the year before because none of the kids had taken being heroes seriously enough to meet the standards of the underground hero. Since they watched the surveillance stream from the support course room, Principal Nezu groaned and said, yes, we are, and I want to hear nothing more on the subject as I've explained it to you several times already. They both kept their eyes on the student in question. Oh, the man groaned. Do we really need his money so badly? Our big, showy dolt of a hero threatens to remove financing, and you give in faster than the Cubs in a championship game. No, but this boy does show potential, Nezu said, shaking his head. He continued, you're worried that this year's crop won't meet your criteria, and you will be forced to expel them again. The small white mammal added, I know you've seen it, too, or else you wouldn't be this adamant about putting him in Class 1B. Since only a small number of hero classes are admitted, you are the reason we are regarded as the most challenging school to apply to, even if our courses to become heroes are some of the most challenging in all of Japan, if not the entire world. And you've been impressed by this youngster. Having him in my class isn't what's bothering me, Aizawa stated. I'll admit that he has guts to taking on mechanical D-rank villains the way he did, but it's the way All Might's been acting. The disheveled man snarled. Did you know that he's even talking about bringing in a vigilante as an additional guard for the campus? He has you by the tail just because you want him to teach here, and you're basically kowtowing to him on everything. Nezu was aware of the man's distaste for ostentatious, glory-hunting heroes. While he poured himself a cup of tea, Nezu sighed and added, yes, I've spoken with him about that as well. It's true, I don't care one bit for it, but this time I think I can agree with it. Hiring this man and taking them in for protection are the least I'm ready to do for their safety because the young girl with the Midoriya family has suffered terribly at the hands of her kidnappers, who have even tried to retake her. About the kid, Aizawa muttered, rubbing his eyes. What does the elderly woman think about her? She hasn't seen her, yet. He said, they've only just arrived, after all, and the child is extremely timid from what I've been told, so it won't do to rush things when we won't see results. The man got up from the couch he was sitting on and groaned, saying, I can't disagree with you on that. All right, I'm going to go read through the list of students that are headed my way. Speaking of kids, why do you always send the suggestions to my class? It's so that I can know for sure that they are worth the effort. Nezu grinned and added, before you know it, I don't send all of them to you. I heard that one student in the recommendations actually turned it down after a minor altercation with the young man he gave his spot to. I've only provided you 2 of the 4 people that accepted the invitation. Vlad King has the other 2 in Class 1B. Aizawa said, he's obviously a product of a quirk marriage, and it's left its mark on him, in more ways than one. The man looked at him and said, yes, but you've given me one of the most troublesome ones. He scowled as he looked down at one of the names on the list, Shoto Todoroki. Kid's got a rare dual-type quirk that mixes his father's and his mother's quirks perfectly. There was one more, but that young man was the one that gave Mr. Todoroki his spot and opted out for Shiketsu High, and I think he'll do well there. Nezu murmured, a shame, really. That was one student that I had taken an interest in myself. Supaidam, a taxi pulled up outside the school's gates, and a tall, well-built man with a duffel bag thrown over his shoulder, his hair in a jumble of black and green curls, and a faint dusting of faded freckles on his nose, got out. He said, thanks, and gave the driver his money. Ya no, I think I've seen you somewhere before, the driver stated, turning to face the elderly man. Ain't you a pro? As he turned and headed toward the school, Hisashi Midoriya said, nah, just a guy that does odd jobs here and there. The man simply shook his head and grinned. The masked guy was startled out of his reverie by the sound of the phone ringing, and he scowled as he grabbed for it, asking, what have you got for me? His tone demanded good news as he asked. Nothing good, boss, the man on the other end of the phone grumbled. You presumably already saw this morning's paper, right? I've just gotten through reading it, the masked guy stated, glancing down at the offending piece of paper in front of him. The men I sent to break Rappa out of prison before he was put in Tartarus said that he's not happy about how that fight ended. The man sighed, I'd imagine not, adding that he was surprised himself. And another thing he heard is that this kid's old man is that sneak thief, the Prowler. He heard that much before the cops showed up, he hissed, before I disciplined my subordinate. He told me that the kid who took the girl and fought Rappa was the same one that I shot. The Prowler, huh? The man in the mask said, furrowing his brow. He frowned, having heard of the mercenary and his violent tendencies, then shook his head, doesn't matter. Where was the girl taken? They carried the child, the girl, and the child's mother to UA. The one place we can't go, boss, the man groaned. High school. The man with the mask tightened his hold on the phone. You can't be serious? Boss, come on, you know I don't do jokes, said the man. And I sure as hell wouldn't joke about the source of the product. Don't you have anyone who has enough of a spine to sneak into the place? The man hissed. For heaven's sake, it's a school, he insisted. And the guys that I've got that do have a quirk are really low on the chain, if you get what I mean. The man on the other end groaned once again. Boss, you have to realize that most of my boys are quirkless, and they're scared of people who have them. Weaklings. All right, the man in the mask growled. From here, I'll handle it. On the trigger shipments, you and your crew simply keep everything moving forward. Understood, he said. Let me know if my men and I can do anything on our end. The masked man hung up the phone without saying anything more. Damn it, of all the places she might be transported, UA, he said, leaning back in his chair. Glaring at the newspaper image, he slammed his palm down on his desk and said, and this kid? Spiderman. He just messed with the wrong people. He pressed his fingers into the paper and watched it tear apart. Kurono. He yelled. His office door opened and he said, you called, Overhaul? A man with pale chin-length hair and thin eyes asked. Seeing the man's eyelids twitch, Overhaul nodded and continued, I want her back, Kurono. Aries been put into UA's custody, he said. Kurono frowned and remarked, that school is a fortress, Overhaul, adding calmly, even we don't have the forces to take them on. They have fortifications that most military bases don't have. Additionally, they have some of the most powerful heroes as instructors. Rumor has it that All Might was supposed to begin teaching there this year. I don't care who they have instructing those brats, Overhaul remarked, frowning at the man. We don't have nearly enough of Ares' cells to further develop the medication. I understand that, but we can't just waltz into UA, Kurono said, shaking his head, and retrieve her. And Ares not likely to be let out of their sight until we're taken into custody, he said thoughtfully, not with All Might in their corner. Rappa said that the kids he fought were strong, and one of them was well trained, almost as good as a pro, but now that they're at UA, we won't be able to touch them. Kurono declared definitively, that little girl is now our worst enemy, Overhaul, and you know it. Of course I know that, said Overhaul sneeringly, but we need her back as soon as possible. We're so close to completing the medication that I can practically taste it, he said, glancing down at his hands, one of which was starting to break out in hives. After giving it some thought, Kurono stated, there might be another way. To get Overhaul's attention, he added, but it'll be dangerous. The man I'm considering is buddies with someone who is just as dangerous as All Might and is more than happy to take a life. Overhaul glared at the guy and said, I don't care what he's ready to do, just so long as he can get my acid back. Do whatever it takes, Kurono, but bring me the girl and murder that little brat that took her from me.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, bye bye.